Ja, schönen guten Morgen an diesem sonnigen Sonntag. Danke fürs Kommen.
Good morning. I'm very happy to see you. Then thank you for coming, even though it is Sunday. We're going to start with a panel discussion, and I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to moderate it. And I'm just going to give you a quick summary of the topic that we're going to be talking about. And then I'm going to introduce the podium participants one by one. And two of the panel participants will give us a very short speech to clarify some terminology. And we have some time for lunch afterwards at 1 in the afternoon. And we're also going to have lots of time for any of your questions and comments.
Es ist tatsächlich ein Panel
So the title of the panel is How to Handle Dealing with Right-Wing Spaces, Decolonization and Cities. So we have different discourses that can sometimes overlap themselves, but they're not really talked in conjunction. So we're trying to bridge that gap and kind of bring these things together without reducing them or setting them off, because we are allowed to know other discourses and debates, for example, the historical debate 2.0, and it's not always easy. So I do think that we are going to manage that today, and that we are not going to get too entangled. It can happen that we get entangled, but we know how to deal with that, simply because it's a very complex question where many historical and current discourses come together. But these are questions that really are at the center of this discussion. We are now in Nuremberg. I do not have to explain what right-wing spaces are here, but we are also going to discuss with Stefan Trübig. But first I want to continue talking about the topic, how we can have more restorative tendencies or even right-wing radical approaches to architecture modality, and how we can deal with these issues in municipal development and urban development, and how these trends within society can introduce a destructive level, and how we can counter this development. And that's what we're already touching upon, the topic of colonization, where Mr. Hart, Noah K. Hart, who is going to talk about that as well. And it's not just about renaming some streets, and I'm not saying that that's not important, but it's more than that. And last but not least, which is also quite important for me, what does that mean for art? What does it mean for artistic activities in the public space, whether they are permanent or temporary? How far do they delve into this discussion, into this area, and how can you express artistic individuality? And also, how can you combine that with the greater common, with the civil society and marginalized groups? So how can we take into account the fact that there are groups that have their own genuine interest, that they are directly affected because they are either victims or survivors of something? But before we start with the actual discussion, I would like to introduce our participants. We're going to start with Stefan Trübig, who is a professor for architecture and culture since 2018. He is the director of the Institute for Basics of Modern Architecture and Design, and he also deals with scenography. He is a teacher of architecture, architecture history and theory, scenography, spatial design at the HFG Karlsruhe, the Zurich University for Art, TU Munich, and Harvard University. He also works with the Arch Plus magazine and initiated a project, Right Wing spaces.
Andrea Pihl, übrigens für
Then we have Andrea Pihl next to her. Henrike Naumann was not able to come because she had fallen ill. So I called Andrea Pihl very spontaneously, and she was able to jump in and fill the gap. And it's very sensitive that Andrea is here, and very logical, and I'm going to explain it in a bit. Andrea Pihl is someone who has dealt a lot and thought a lot about right-wing spaces, and she considers the history of the GDR and how the history continues after reunification. So Andrea Pihl lives and works in Berlin. She studied fine arts at the Berlin Weissensee School of Art and Chelsea College of Art, London. And she has had many solo exhibitions and group exhibitions. I'm not going to list them all because there are many, many, many. And she also has held a seminar on this very topic and discussed right-wing spaces at the universities. And she's probably going to tell us about that as well. And on the left to her, we have Mr. Mark Cooking, who is a landscape architect and chairman of something that is quite known in Nuremberg, the association Paulus Initiative for Architecture and Publicity. And the Nuremberg-based association has set itself the task of sensitizing the urban public to the architecture of the city. In addition to panel discussions, he also had a summer school. We had a summer school at the rally grounds here in Nuremberg. So he was talking about delicate or difficult architectonical inheritance that we have from history. And then we have Mr. Noah Kaha, who is an urban researcher, and since October 2021, she has been teaching at the Kunsthochschule Berlin-Weissensee at MA Spatial Strategies with Professor Dr. Bonaventure Ndikung and Professor Nasatur, and is a substitute. She is leading the National Discrimination and Racism Monitor at the DISM Institute, which is the German Center for Integration and Migration Research in Berlin until February 2022. And there are a couple of other things that we could say about her. She also was an acting scientific director at the DISM, and she also worked at the Technical University of Dresden, at the Technical University of Berlin, and she is a founding member of the Society for Racism Critical Postcolonial and Decolonial Research and Practice, which is called Dekolonial, is an association of the name, and she is also active as at the Asian German Association Orientation e.V. And last but not least, we have Mr. Oliver Hart, who is a director and filmmaker. And for many years, his documentary films, we're going to see a trailer, here he has explored Black history and culture, often with a focus on contemporary art, architecture, and design. His intentionally acclaimed movies, we have Black Germany from 2006, which is an intimate study of the thoughts and feelings of not a small minority in Germany. Then we have the United States of Hoodoo, a road trip to the spiritual sources of African American culture. Then we have a movie called David Adjaye, Collaborations, and 2018 he brought out a movie called The Black Museum, a documentary about the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. We're also going to talk about this building during our panel discussion, and it's a mall, it's in a national mall in a very central location in the capital city of the United States. And while he created that, Hart was cooperated the movie over several years. Our films have been screened at film festivals and on television all over the world, as well as the context of exhibitions. It is also included in the movie program of Kara Walker that she had put together yesterday with a focus on, how would you say it, Afro-German movies or movies by people of color in Germany. And Stefan and Noah, they are going to clarify some terminology quite briefly to set the frame, set the context for the discussion so that we know what the basis is for our discussion. and we can add a couple of things, but it would be a good idea to just define two things that we need to do beforehand.
Thank you very much, Jörg Kaiser, for inviting me and for introducing me. I've brought a few pictures. Of course, we could now start the PowerPoint presentation, please. Before the PowerPoint is visible, some introductory remarks from my side. Of course, my input, I understand it to be my task to explain a few keywords. Right-wing spaces is an invitation for a longer essay or a longer lecture talking about the questionability of the right-left division in the recent past. I won't topicalize that right now, but of course we know that many theoreticians and sociologists have... I think the monitor boxes are not switched on. Little technical remark. Right-wing spaces, of course, must be seen as a kind of keyword, maybe even a bit, sort of seductive alliteration. The corona pandemic has shown us that in order to understand certain political things, people have shaped. You should look at rather threatening alliances, like this left-right split, which has been happening at least since the 1980s internationally and has been questioned there, is owed to a particular space, to the French Parliament, where after the French Revolution, the right, the monarchists, and on the left were the Republicans. So this was a kind of a way of describing their position. For reasons of time, I won't make any remarks about this topic, right-left dichotomy, and the political positions linked to this, which of course were very different at different times. And I would like to just look at a few keywords and share a few observations. I identify in various research contexts, I define right-wing spaces in different dimensions. The individual residence for, inverted commas, the last members of the people's community, Volksgenossen. Boto Strauß's house, for example, should be mentioned, who has written various essays about the last German, so maybe the lonely house of the NPD politician Otto Pasteur's in Lipten should be mentioned. It's a private home, but it's also the backdrop for YouTube channel of the Deutsche Stimme TV, which the next step above the lonely residence would be a settlement. I quote, inverted commas, talks about the death of the people. And these are sort of settlers in the rural area. And they talked about, looked at these right-wing settlements in the rural areas and topicalized this. The next step above this would be then places with a historical meaning that would be used for right-wing experiences, because Nuremberg comes into play very quickly, because in the history of federal German right-wing extremism can't be thought without the castles and residences in the Nuremberg area. Hoffmann, who founded the so-called Wehrsportgruppe Hoffmann, he was in several castles in Germany, Schloss Almershof, then Schloss Ermreuth. In Ermreuth, as we all know, in the 80s, up to 400 armed militant people prepared for a revolt, a revolution. So far, I've only talked about places which are in the rural area, but maybe for this topic, for this today's conference, the conference of the past few days, it's important to talk about the question how far there are right-wing spaces in inner cities. What does this left-right dichotomy done for what has it to do with the politics of remembering and commemoration? Architectural theory says a right-wing theory is the initiative of reconstructing, for example, the Garnison Church reconstructed, which is
Rechtsextremisten im Grunde lanciert wurde.
Was initiated by a right-wing extremist, is also being observed by the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, and was taken over by the AfD for Germany. And of course, the AfD is very happy about this development. And I would like to stop with a few pictures that have something to do with Nuremberg. Again and again. There's discussions mainly about how to deal with the party rally grounds, and this discourse is a discourse connected to good suitability, and basically the history of use of the party rally grounds in the post-war years shows a long series of the meeting of the Sudeten-German Association in 1955 on the Zeppelin Grandstand with many, many flags. This was a torchlight parade of the right-wing scene in 2019. Also faux pas when Albert Speer's Dome of Light was reproduced by Rock in the Park. And currently it's also in Nürnberg about what is going to happen with the interim opera house. The current state of affairs says that it's supposed to be inserted in the Congress Hall into the torso of the Congress Hall, and people are already afraid of having a Meistersinger production in the Congress Hall. I'll be finishing my remarks. I hope I've given you enough keywords to deal with. Thank you. Yes, indeed you did. I think we will be talking about one or the other thing in the course of this debate, particularly Nuremberg examples. But before we do this, and Garnison Church will be talking about this with you. You looked at the topic of Potsdam, but first of all, Noah Haar. Could you give us the complementary, the opposite? How do you decolonize cities?
Man kann mich hören.
You can hear me? Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much for the introduction on right-wing spaces. Thank you very much for the invitation. I believe that what we could very clearly see in these images is the historical relationship to national socialism and the European colonialism. And so we have a history, we have 500 years of history that we are touching upon. And what does that mean for us in the cities? And one of the things that I would like to mention is that in Germany and in Europe we have a process of how to handle with the national socialism, and we can debate over how it's done, whether it's being well or not, but we also need to work off and reappreciate European colonialism as well. So we have 500 years that we're looking at, especially at the beginning. Maybe in 1492 was the most well-known year, where that was the year of the discoveries of Columbus, and then that's what led to the nation states afterwards. Just to give you a bit of an historical outlook of what we're talking about. We're talking about different European nation states, for example, like British colonialism, the French colonialism, Belgian, and that of the Netherlands. There are great differences between one kind of colonialism and the other. On a global scale, the European colonialism affected basically the entire globe. There are very few geographical contexts that were not touched by colonialism, for example, the eastern side of Africa. But I'm talking about South America, Asia, and the Pacific. That's on the one hand, and on the other hand, especially considering what we understand under the concept of racism, you need to differentiate between metropolitan colonial context and settler colonial context. For example, Canada and Australia, where we have to ask who are the marginalized groups there and what does it mean for us here in Europe. Because this question is not only about the history of racism, but also colonialism in relationship to the question of racism. What does it have to do with us today? And what do I mean when I talk about decolonization of cities? Decolonization of cities is not only about renaming streets. I have been sat on panels where people have asked, don't we have more important things to do? And my answer is, why do we have to talk about that so much? That, for example, we rename a Lüderitz street, knowing that Lüderitz was a person who was not someone who was very heroic in the German colonialist history, so to speak. So it's an interesting question that why, when it comes to some names, we still have to talk about it, and why are we not focusing on the greater picture? What I want to say with that is that when it comes to architecture, there is, for example, the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, which is a very eclectic example. Why was it built? Why was it built the way it was built? What is the content? What are the debates that are involved? And then you also have the question of urban planning. If you have a look at the history of urban planning, many urban planning methods were born in the colonies and then they were imported back to Europe. So we have to kind of like sort through this entire history, what racified groups, which religions, what kind of people are living in what cities. We can think, for example, of a city in France. And then also when you have, for example, the African districts that have that are European citizens, they have to be informed that they are being basically colonized. So there are many debates regarding how to name the streets. And then you also have the issue of what is a city, what are the municipal or urban epistemologies, what is our concept of a European city. That is a question that will also lead to my next question and last question. If we're talking about European cities, and this is a urban sociological model that, especially after the end of the Cold War, it has gotten into the limelight, especially the development of the Humboldt Forum, for example, the European city versus the American city, for example, and what is a colonist narratives that we want to establish. So if we're talking about these 500 years, we're talking about colonization. That means we have to talk a lot about traces and clues that we can find in the cities. We're trying to look at colonial traces. If we walk through Nuremberg and I pass through the M pharmacy, and here I can see a very racist image, and it is very sad that we have that very racist image in the middle of town without a comment. And it's not only in Nuremberg, in many other different cities you have the same problem. There are scandals that arise because of that. That is a clue or a trace or a lead that they are basically the colonial inheritance, because it's not just some individual spaces, but it really defines how we understand our cities and how we understand the concept of public space. And when it comes to public space, we also need to ask ourselves who has access to them, who can move around them, who sees them, who monitors them, because it does not apply to everyone. I, for example, a racified woman, cannot move freely everywhere because there are places where I'm not quite sure whether I'm welcome there. And I think that's also something that we need to take into account when we try in our understanding of public space. And the last point I wanted to make is that within this historic perspective, we want to have a very concrete look at what happened in the past 30 years. We had great anti-colonial movements. We had the independence movements in the 70s, and then the end of the Cold War. And in the mid-90s in Europe, we've seen a recently that the colonial narrative has become the focus again. We can see it with the Humboldt Forum and the expos in Seville and in Lisbon. We can see that in Hamburg, in Hamburg City. And for me, it is also a question that is fascinating, but at the same time, it is very unsettling how this Eurocentric colonial history was reborn. And how now, precisely now, thanks to the demographic change, we have a younger generation. They say, wait, if I am in Germany, if I'm in Europe, and if I'm part of Europe, then I want that my history, even if it's from a colonial context, that they want our history to be told as well. And that's why we are sitting here, because now in 2020, last year, with Hanno, Halle, Black Lives Matter, we were able to see that it is unavoidable. We must talk about right-wing extremism, but also about racism.
Thank you very much. It's very important what you mentioned last, that we not only talk about a dissociated historical debate, how to evaluate and assess the past, but that we talk about the horrible acts that happened in the name of this past or denying this past. And the worst example, but I mean one of the worst examples, but an illustration of the ideology of this cynical ideology is the attack in Halle, where somebody, an attacker, tries to kill Jewish people, and because he doesn't succeed, he seemingly haphazardly kills a passing woman and a man, and kills these two, and tries to kill a supposedly black person by driving into them with his car, defining these individuals as enemies, representatives of a culture that he hated and considers an enemy culture. And I think this is ideologically exactly the point where this historians debate that is happening right now. And Jürgen Habermas said this, summed this up very well, if only in a very shortened manner. There is a context between colonization and colonial history and National Socialism and Holocaust, but I would maybe say in the sense of an inversion that the ideology of colonization was a colonization that went to the outside, to the other, that was supposedly more primitive, to conquer this, maybe fight this, or even kill these, to promote, in inverted commas, civilization. And they had the ideologies to go with that, the philosophies to go with that, civilizing the rest of the world. So Hitler and the Nazis, after 1925, they talked about, inverted commas, internal colonization, because they lost the German colonies. They said, we have to make up for this. Let's do it like the German emperors, Nürnberg, crown jewels. They, in the 9th century, they fought against the Hungarians and established the Eastern Empire, Österreich. So the insignia were taken from Vienna to Nürnberg again, and this was an ideologically charged space, which was also thought in a kind of idea of inverted commas colonization to the interior of the city, to fight against the internal cosmopolitan enemy, and they saw the Jews as parasites and cosmopolitans. And what I want to say with this is, if we, for example, look at the African Quarter in Berlin, where we have Togo, Cameroon Street, where all the German possessions, in inverted commas, were made into street names, but not in a respectful manner, in a signal to Cameroon, but also saying this is ours too. So we have to do some work here, but we mustn't just you can't remove this, you can't separate this from National Socialism and its horrible crimes and the Shoah. That I just wanted to add this as a first suggestion of how these two topics might be more thought together, more, seen together. I would like to ask Oliver Hart to join the discussion for two reasons. You told me an anecdote from Frankfurt that I can tell here that illustrates again what you mentioned. It's a kind of funny normalization, or still, or again. What's the problem? People say, what's the problem? Humboldt Forum, there's an exhibition about ivory, for example, where they say it's beautiful and horrible at the same time. It's horribly beautiful. There are horrible aspects of it. There's a colonization, but ivory is just beautiful. I had to think of the anecdote that you told me. Maybe you want to tell it, and then we can show the trailer of your film. It's not the same topic, but we'll come back to it. Then, when I listened, lots of points came up that I can relate to, and I will have to think, where do I make my point? But Frankfurter, I worked with Stefan Trübis of the new Old Town in Frankfurt. We've got a new acquisition in Frankfurt inner city, a reconstruction of how people thought the medieval times were. This is, of course, for me, as Frankfurter, is a fantastic example where you can see all these restorative movements that refer to a history that never was. But I think what you think is the restaurant where I go into the S-Bahn and the suburban railway and to the opposite the two Deutsche Bank towers. For many, many years there's been a restaurant, the Ivory Club, and they advertise saying that their menu has a concept, contemporary colonial cuisine, which has a big sign at the door with two crossed ivory tusks. This is public space. It's in the public space. If you go to the S-Bahn, you go past this entrance, and there's two people in livery standing right and left, and there's valet parking, and you can take your stretch limousine. You don't have to look for a parking space, which is difficult in Frankfurt or impossible. So everything is catered for. So you stand in front of this, and you're lost for words, for these two crossed tusks and the declaration that it's contemporary colonial cuisine. And I think this is what you were talking about, and I immediately thought about this because this is something that touches you immediately. And at that moment, I saw this. I've been seeing this for many years, and I think the restaurant's been about for 20 years or longer. But every time I look at it, it makes me kind of speechless because it's sort of it's kind of taken for read. There's another example in Frankfurt Old Town. There are people even from my surroundings who I would say they have a bit of critical thinking. I hear the same argument. Well, it's quite nice. It looks nice. So the ideological substrata can be forgotten, because it's so aesthetic. So cool down. It's not so bad because it looks good. And I think this is the problem we have had quite often when we talk about public space and about making it all look nice and pretty and retrospective, and it's a restorative and a restoration of buildings and squares and so on. I think there's a lot of examples about that. So I've been thinking this is a really fantastic. We keep thinking about your trailer, but I would like to pick this up because that's also what you hear about Potsdam, and also about Berlin, about the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. So it's reconstruction of the cityscape in Paris and London. They've been doing this. They've got the Louvre and they've got Trafalgar Square and so on and so forth. You can understand this thought, but the consequence from this is questionable. My impression, also after what Stefan Trüby said about right-wing spaces, is that it means more. If you say we take a leap back in history, call it tradition, call it reconstructing something that was before, but also implying, or it could be implying anyway, or that the image of the people, the homogeneous German people, whether it ever was that homogeneous is another question, whether this fantasy of a homogeneous people, you want this back. This is a thesis I would like to sort of just present here, but it has something to do with the question about decolonization. But could you just give us your impression of the developments in Potsdam and also what you hear it often? Why are you so excited? It looks nice.
Or in Potsdam and in Berlin, we have. It's very difficult to hear. Okay. Yeah. Yes. So both in Potsdam and in Berlin, but much more in Potsdam, we have a paradigmatic role of the history of GDR and the urban planning ideas of the GDR, how the ruins and the castle were demolished and the reconstruction, and we have the garrison church and the reconstruction as we had with the Humboldt Forum and the Palace of the Republic. That was all included in the GDR urban planning that I dealt with. So this back and forth between historicism, the formalism debates that were rejected at some point, and then they turned towards constructive buildings and functionalism. And then Honecker, he had then again the dogma that you should not count on reunification in 1974, and then the Garrison Church and the Old Market and the Landtag and the reconstruction of the castle focused on that, and then all the streets were redesigned. So we have to see that in that context. So did I understand that correctly? That Honecker and the City Council of the GDR in 75, they said, okay, we're not going to have reunification, so we need our own tradition and our history that we can tell, for example, our connection to Prussia and Prussian aspects, not the other way around. 1975, they turned away from that. The Garrison Church and the castle were demolished in 67. And until 75, they had the belief that the historical buildings, they had to integrate them in this new socialist city. And in 75, Honecker and the city council decided that they wanted to negate that and that they could demolish everything. Okay, and now it's being restored and reconstructed. For example, the Garrison Church. Could you just tell us what it means to rebuild that? Well, when the wall came down, then you had this victim belief, this victim attitude, where historic buildings were victim of the socialist construction projects and of the socialist way of life. that had been created before. And then there was this old market, the castle was demolished. And at the times of the GDR, you could still see the floor plan of the castle. They had put flowers up to mark where the walls had stood. And then before the wall came down in 1988, they decided to build a theater, Hans Otto Theater, but it was a raw construction, and after the wall came down in 1991, then it was demolished again. It was demolished, and then they already started discussing that they wanted to have the castle again, and they wanted the garrison church. And then the Fortuna Portal was built with donations and the help of Plattner and Jauch. And the Fortuna Portal, sorry, I just need to check because I had very little time. And the Fortuna Portal was the entry to the Potsdamer Castle, and it was used for the Prussian king who crowned himself. So now I kind of got lost in my speech. What I would think is interesting is what that means from an ideological point of view. The garrison church, what does it mean to have such a church and rebuild it as it was originally? I know that the party AfD is very adamant about having this church rebuilt, but if people who do not know the history cannot understand what's going on there, or I don't know, is the history of the garrison church known? No, it is not. That's why I'm asking. Well, maybe you could explain that, or maybe the two of you could kind of help each other out to help us understand what the background is of why the AfD, which is a right-wing party, why they're happy about the garrison church.
There's lots of details that need to be mentioned. The garrison church was the church of Prussian militarism, was closely connected to Prussian colonial history, German colonial history. But of course, it's a historic place where Hitler and Hindenburg shook hands, and the handshake where German conservatism and the right-wing extremists made their pact. And this on the initiative of a right-wing extremist who then was still working for the German army but was chucked out there. It was reconstructed, and insofar this right-wing extremist had installed a Glockenspiel and had it cast especially, and wanted to give it to Potsdam, but only under the condition that the church around this Glockenspiel would be reconstructed. So this is the history behind it. And what's really important, the inscription on this Glockenspiel, and what the reconstruction means. It started immediately after the fall of the wall. Max Glas is the right-wing extremist that Stefan Trüppel was talking about. Immediately after even before the fall of the wall, he said this Glockenspiel had to be reconstructed. And these are quite interesting, to each his own, which is sort of something that was written on concentration camp doors. And there's all the infantry divisions 200 meters away from, there's a playground with a table where all the people who gave money are named, and it's just sitting there, and it's not told to anybody. There's no information about it. I took a little booklet. I did a seminar at the art school with students, and there's a brochure by the Garrison Church, and you can see how history is being falsified. They advertise with history, remembering and taking responsibility and living reconciliation without telling people what this history was. And there are school projects, students are invited, they may do projects. It's really, not a good development what's happened there. I would like to pick up this thought. This is something that will come up in all the various aspects of discussion. Well, what do you want? It's not all that bad. Aren't you exaggerating? Aren't you getting a bit too excited about this? That's the one side. And the other side is a sort of an active rhetoric of calming down, of smoothing over kind of rhetoric. But in order to cover it over so people don't look too closely, because you ask yourself, why does Günther Jauch support a project that the AfD the right-wing party finds great? He's one of the most well-known representatives in Potsdam. The same thing as far as colonial history is concerned. When I talk about the Humboldt Forum, as one horrible, embarrassing fact after the other. You can just lean back and watch what's behind all these things that somebody has found out. These things will just go on. There'll be one story after another will be experienced with that Humboldt Forum. I talked about the example of the continuity of the Nazi artists, where the entire history of the documenta needs to be reassessed, for example. I just would like to hint to this. I wanted to add that what Andrea said, this active falsification of history, proactive falsification of history, colonial history was forgotten, and it's about generating commemoration again, generating memory. It's an active process. It's a process which is not, it's active process, not to mention a certain part of history in school books. And it's our task to take it into schools and to promote this. It's very difficult. If we look at, for example, you build up the Garnison Church and you reconstruct the Humboldt Forum, and what became clear to me that this discussion, it was a German debate, GDR history, post-GDR history. What I find disturbing is that in the early 90s, historically, we had the opportunity to tell a new history, tell a new story after the end of the Cold War, but instead of that, one returned to the provinces, one referred to Prussia, we have the Garrison Church, we have the Humboldt Forum, but meantime it's clear Humboldt Forum is toxic. We really built something which I'd say because we built it, because we reconstructed an old castle, even they're trying to combine it with modern architecture. This promotes and strengthens forces that are on the extreme right-wing end of politics. And I think there's a connection, this nation building and the fact that AfD have so many percentage points of parliamentarians in the parliaments. And we have to look at this. And I'm one of the ones who says we built it so we can demolish it. I would love it for the German parliament at one time to decide we will demolish it and we'll have a new process of thinking what to do with this space. It's backward looking and not into the future. And with the heritage that we have here, we have a problem. But it's still going to be cheaper than the BER airport. So I think it can be done financially. I pick this up because I think, of course, we're in Nuremberg, and I'm thinking about this is where picking up the way of dealing with this heritage or this past is very immediate. Nazis do their torchlight parades on the Zeppelin Grandstand, but more often there are selfies on the Zeppelin Grandstand. This happens every day and every night that Nazis go there with the Hitler greeting and do selfies. And as far as I know, the most important thing was the rainbow prelude. Was rainbow. They painted the pillars in rainbow colors, and there was an anonymous artists group who did that, amongst others, in order to, destroy their selfies. I think that was one of the ideas behind doing this Rainbow Prelude. I know that you've been dealing with the party grounds very intensely. And what is the idea in the city right now? How to deal with this? That spaces like these not only are kind of used for critical historical dispute, but also it's used by people in an open right-wing dispute, start taking ownership. How do you, with Paulus, work with this, and how does the city deal with this, in your opinion? First of all, for us, when this work of art was made, the Rainbow Prelude, from my point of view, it was suddenly a commemoration. There's this Zeppelin Grandstand and there's the former party rally grounds that you look at this topic anew. That's been, the debate has to be started anew. Meantime, it's been, the grandstand is supposed to be made safe to walk over for just about €100 million. It's been, so it doesn't crumble any further, and it's made safe. What goes into this discussion? Basically, Baulust internally, we were actually quite happy about this artist action, but at the same time, we were really completely disturbed how immediately the city of Nuremberg had these colors washed off. And people said this, washing it down with high pressure cleaners destroyed even more, at a low level, more damage than what would have done with the washable paint. So much about that. What came to my mind when we talk about this topic? It doesn't look so bad. We in Baulust have a controversial discussion about how to deal with the Zeppelin Grandstand. It goes from let it all decay. We don't have to spend €1 to maintain this historic heritage, but maybe you could make part of it safe so we can walk about it, however badly it looks. So if you have an area where they started examining how to restore and make safe the grandstand, I looked at this and whether this it's not a bit much, that it looks a lot better afterwards, and so it kind of casts in stone this thought. 1,000 years empire, what the National Socialists didn't manage, we do with new technology and new stone and concrete, and then it'll keep for the rest of times. Another place that we've been looking at in the past is the square that's dedicated to the victims of fascism. And this is where the US Americans established this as the first commemorative space in Nuremberg. It's a huge stone, which on the former Wodan Square, just opposite the Luitpold Grove and the Meistersingerhalle. And in the past year, the city of Nuremberg redesigned this square in a manner that we all really just were staggered with. The new flower beds were made and in a stripy pattern, and the stone, which was in a lawn, was newly framed, so you can walk to it.
Granitblockbank als Stein
irgendwie daneben gesetzt. Granite bench set there so you can sit down, and it's a manner of designing this square. So let's say now we've done it, and this entire square is supposed to be changed. It's still a talk that the new Philharmonic Hall, the concert house, is to be built. And then, of course, this entire square could be rethought. But this is another thing that we ask ourselves. temporary design sometimes lasts for a very long time. Why did they do this? Why did they start doing something, redesigning something in a manner that and make it more pretty, which has nothing to do with the thought that's behind it?
In dem Zusammenhang habe ich, glaube ich, vorher schon mal erwähnt.
In that context, I had already mentioned it before, but I'm going to do it again now. There's a lot that is said about the Zeppelin stage. And in Berlin, they talk about the Glockenturm Mai era in the Olympia Stadium, which also has the same, the Mayfield has a very similar context. And I think that they had 40 or even more million of people who wanted to make a sports museum there. And that is something that is very meticulously being perpetuated as the way how Adolf Hitler had imagined it to be. And then they learned that you all know the Olympia Stadium from TV, for example. There is a marathon gate where they call it a marathon gate, but they should actually name it Adolf Hitler Gate because it was left open so that from the tribunal from the tribune they could listen to the Glockenspiel. That's why we have that opening, that gap in the Olympia Stadium. And that is left standing as it is. And that's why the question is, should we let things destroy, should we let things get demolished, or should we keep them? And for example, in the Albert Speer, he also had said that his vision of these buildings, of how we're going to have them, how they're going to look like now and in future. Are we going to kind of preserve them like a kind of a Disney World, or are we going to do something else? And that's something that we can discuss later on as well. What would the third option be? It's a question that not only Nuremberg has to ask themselves, but when it comes to the culture of commemoration, how do you deal with these buildings and the ideologies that they represent? And that's why I would like to look at the trailer, and maybe we have this 2-minute video, and here we have a comparison to the United States to see what we can learn from this.
If you want to understand American notions of resiliency or optimism or spirituality, you've got to look to the African American community. America would not have the culture that it has today without the contribution of African Americans. And that museum tells the story. I really love the idea, even just the shape was informed by both a sort of an African and an African American presence.
This is a museum where the container and the content are one.
The current museum really tells everything: the good, the bad, the failures, the struggles, the disappointments, the absences, the violence, the deaths. I mean, it's all there to reckon with and to think about.
Man kann den Film, glaube ich, auf Vimeo gegen kleinen.
This video is available on Vimeo. It does not cost a lot. You can see the full-length, feature-length movie there. And I think would be very productive for the discussion to introduce this comparison. But we already talked about the Humboldt Forum, and I'm going to rewind a little bit now. We also talked about in the year 2000, we talked about the Shoah, the mass murders against the Jews in Europe. And I was the skeptics back then. And they said, yes, it is appalling that such a huge and imposing building is right next to the Purgatory. And as Björn Höcke, he said from his fascistic point of view, it is a monument of horror that we have in the middle of the city. And that's exactly what it is. It is a central visibility that cannot be negated anymore, and it plays an important role. And here in Nuremberg, I always hear that the discussion always goes about whether we can commemorate within the medieval city walls or outside of them. And if we have a look at the African American History Museum, for example, I remember that it talked about Agent Piper, who is a concept artist who lived in Berlin. She's African American, and she said that how do other Americans in the United States, for example, Susan Nymund, and they're in Potsdam, how they do deal with that. And they got all this criticism to the German past, but they kind of managed it quite well. And that's an example that we can take. So sometimes it is necessary to have a kind of a signal, a kind of a sign that you have there, and it will impulse debate and a discourse. And with the Humboldt Forum, it's just went wrong. It just went wrong in all the ways it could have gone wrong. So, but maybe we could try to do something similar like David R.J. did in the mall, in the middle of the capital of the American capital. It was built right across the street from the African American History Museum. Perhaps, could you tell us what this building actually means? And its contents, of course. Yeah, sure, and that's exactly the reason why it's very complex. You're talking about the two aspects, the aspect of the monument on the one hand, and on the other hand, the aspect of the museum, the content and the program in the museum. I'm sorry. And central visibility is a very crucial point in this debate, and it was also misformulated when it comes to media reporting. In every state of the United States, we have an Afro-American museum, and they say that it is the first one, but that is not quite true. The key point is that it is highly visible in a national place, national mall. And the museum was built on the last available plot at the National Mall. And you have to consider the demands for a central place for Afro-American history. It's 100 years of history, so it took 100 years until we could build this place, this museum. And central visibility is a key word here, but also we need an aesthetic statement. If you have a look at a National Mall that is built according to very strict plans, this building had a very strong context. I'm not talking about the program and not the program. A very strong and interesting aesthetical concept. In the trailer, you could see it quite briefly. You had the porch, which is kind of like a terrace in front of the museum. And before the symposium, I thought about what would be the counterpart of a right-wing space. What really are we talking about left-wing spaces? And I think the counterpart of a right-wing space would be something that can be used by minorities, and that makes it safe. And this porch to the museum, it's a large ranch made out of concrete. It's a concrete roof that will protect people from the heat because it gets really hot in summer. But it is also a reference to the Afro-American porches that you can find in the southern states, where you have a little terrace with a little roof on top, where really it was a way of climatization, but it is a protected space. It's not only a museum that is visited by black people, but it is also very highly frequented by all kinds of people. And this space in front of the museum is the counterpart of the right-wing spaces. So it is public, but it is also protected. The museum itself has a problem that on the one hand it is a monument, and on the other hand it is a museum that has a certain program. It is a history museum, it is a culture museum, it is everything at the same time. And that can be a problem because in this form it can also be overwhelming, not only for the museum but also for the visitors of the museum. It takes a lot of time to go through it. You start in the basement. You were only able to see a very small part, but it has 4 floors, subterranean floors, because it was really, really big. And of the National Mall, you cannot build on top of it because of the floor plan. So that's why instead of building up, they started to build down. So you can walk through the museum from the bottom to the top, and they started doing this 500 years ago. You look at the history of 500 years ago, and as you go up, you get closer to contemporary times, and then you also have temporary exhibits. But what I also think is quite important is that when we talk about American history, many people say that American history is European history. It's not something that is separate from our history.
Ich muss kurz springen, weil mir ist das so über 2020.
And I have to remember in 2020 we had the case about Hanau. Yes, that's what happened in Hanau. But
George Floyd and Black Lives
Matter,
die Riesenwelle verursacht.
That was the incident that triggered the movement also here in Europe. And here in Europe, especially in Germany, we have this externalization when it comes to racism and racist violence. That what happens in the United States, there sometimes people forget history as well. It is European history, it was the Europeans. There is no such thing as an American, except of course the indigenous Americans. But this externalization plays a role, and that's why this museum is so interesting for Europeans here in Europe, not only in a positive way, but also it is a history that apparently does not have anything to do with us. So you also have to have a look at the architect. The architect is a European, he was a British person, British Canadian.
And
in this museum, there are so many complex factors. Its form that was derived from the Jehovah's sculpture, and then you also have African-American architecture and references in the porch, and that was created with an American architect. And all of these things, they make it incredibly complex, overly complex, and you have to kind of learn to deal with this complexity. You have to deal with the fact that we have this building that's there, and under the administration of George W. Bush, that's when we had the Congress resolution to build it in the first place. So it's a very complex thing that's going on here. And I don't know, it's really difficult to put it into words. I do not know what we can learn from this, except of being persistent. Because this is a perseverance of 100 years. This history of perseverance, what we had, 100 years that it took to build it. Sometimes we have a perseverance of 30 years, especially when it comes from a congressman, that he just persevered and insisted, and the ability to persevere, it is something that impressed me quite a lot. Because they just persevered in spite of all the backlash they got. They knew it was important, they knew they needed it, and now it's here.
Stefan, you wanted to say something. I would like to encourage you all to intervene. And I'd like to open up to the audience as well. I would like to pick up on a few things that Noah and Oliver Hart said, and which of course I agree with. But first of all, an introductory remark about the question, what's the opposite of a right-wing space?
das ist die Frage, die ich nach
That's the
jedem
question
meiner Vorträge
that
gefragt werde.
I've been asked after each of my lectures. Can we talk about left-wing spaces? Not because,
vor allem deswegen, weil ich
mainly because I've asked myself whether the opposite of right-wing might not be just. Talking about right-wing spaces formulated the deliberative spaces where dispute can happen, where discourse can happen. This sounds nice. It's in sociological essays. It's not harmful, but I'm finding it very difficult with the idea that you invite neo-Nazis to Sunday morning workshops and you can actually make them agents in refugee help. I think you need to be very idealistic or blue-eyed. I think they need decades of empathy training. These are activities you have. These kind of negotiations have. You have to negotiate. One thing I would like to say that I didn't really talk about in my short introduction, the concept that hasn't been talked about a lot in this discussion, but which has been talked about in the entire conference, multi-directional commemoration. This is a concept of multi-directional commemoration is part of the space of right-wing spaces. We've been doing walks in cities in cooperation with various theaters in Munich, in Berlin, in Frankfurt. We did these walks, and it also topicalized this colonial food shop. In this trailer of Oliver Hart's film, there was one moment which was particularly interesting when the architect David Adjaye said that this museum has a content and container as one. This is what the Humboldt Forum doesn't do, definitely. And I'm saying this because, and I hope I'm not being kicked out. I was a member of the jury for the exhibition design for the Humboldt Forum. I'm part of the guilty group. I did this at some time. When I thought that we could have an appropriation art, and we didn't want to repeat what we've done, particularly in the history of photography. This belief in authenticity went into a reactionary trace.
So that's what appropriation art actually stands for in architecture. And since then, I have changed my opinion. I've made a 180-degree turn. This emancipatorial movement just is not possible. Automatically, when you repeat things in architecture, you become affirmative. And the problem with the Humboldt Forum was, and from today's viewpoint, it is an ethnological museum of the 21st century, and we have an architecture here that is, in the first place, due to the money that came in through slavery, but also the money that came from Prussia, in the colonized areas, Groß Friedrichsburg, now Ghana. But that you could have touched upon that. You could have made it relevant in the architecture as well, in an architecture that does repeat things, but that was just impossible to do because suddenly you have this structure on top. And they told us that the cupola was financed by Marin Otto, and if you have a look at that, of course, it was doomed to fail. And that's why we talked about this project very intensively, because the Humboldt Forum was one of the most important cultural projects of the German Federal Republic of the years of Merkel. And I think that something just went completely wrong here, something that could only have been solved with the very deep-seated intellectual philosophies.
We discussed about appropriation art. that we have these flags here, because in Nuremberg the Holy Lands was part of the insignia. Leave it here. It's good to have it appropriated in a different manner, in a different discourse. But looking at its monumental status in the heart of our capital city contributes to this building in its pseudo-reconstruction of the original Hohenzollern castle. Can't be redefined. You can really only tear it down, demolish it. I was inside for the first time the other day. It's hard to bear as a complete architectural car accident, car crash. It's a restorative Prussian architecture co-financed by an heir of Otto mail order company whose money is, as far as I know, is to a large extent coming from the Nazi era, from an Aryanized, at least partly Aryanized Jewish property. Another footnote, but that you go into this building, it's a really strange Disney shopping mall, an Albert Speer-like foyer, very high, with a kind of football stadium display wall, and then you go into a hall which basically has elevators like in an airport or in a shopping mall, and gets you to the exhibition, which then, en detail, produces one car crash after another, as far as history and its description is concerned. But I'll just ask the group, how can, apart from demolishing it, and which probably needs perseverance to get that done, but how can we deal with it? It's maybe the wrong word. How can we counter these spaces and what they stand for? Are there any strategies, ideas, examples, historical examples maybe even? From my point of view, one example is a very traditional one. It's that of an investigative uncovering. So, for example, Platz der Opfer des Faschismus, Square of the Victims of Fascism. I was in the exhibition, the list of people, gifted by God, and the tapestry in the Meistersinger Halle is by Caspar, the Nazi designer who put inlay work in Hitler's desk in the Staatskanzlei, and the parades, and he designed the parades for the opening of the House of German Art, and he was commissioned to design this tapestry in 1966, and it's still there to this day, and it's just in Berlin in the exhibition. In the Meistersinger Halle, where you can actually look onto the square of the victims of fascism. So you have the winners of fascism and the victims of fascism. If you look on this tapestry, just an example for what there is, and B, how you could deal with it. I mean, you should at least uncover it. I didn't know about this, and many other people don't. This would need some research. What can we do apart from research?
No, I don't know if that is the idea, but it's something that we could also introduce, the multi-directional way of remembering, of commemoration, and we also had the example of the Zeppelin of the Zeppelin area. It's not only the history of the winners, but it's also the history of perpetrators. And so we have a perpetrator architecture. How can we deal with that? Should we just let it crumble? Should we rebuild it? For example, the Mayfield and the Olympia Stadium. And I ask myself, it's not a question about aesthetics, but it's also a question of whose history are we telling here? And if we have a look at the trailer, I think it was quite clear to see that you can also see things from an Afro-American perspective, and where they can say American history is also our history. And that's why it's important that at a national hall in the United States, it's important to also have a room to tell our own history as well. And with the Humboldt Forum, we have a form of nation building. And what can we do with this? Is it against the public? Is it a counter-architecture? It's a process on that way, yes, but I do believe that basically it's not only a question of commemoration, because it's a commemoration of the victims, for example. There's this entire discussion on how we want to commemorate the victims of colonialism. There's a debate on that. Should we have like one central place to do so? Should we have the debate on this central, or do we need many different decentralized places? Should every city, every community have one? Every community, every city has to ask themselves, how from my own city, how did we contribute to colonialization? How are we going to make this colonialist history visible? And if we have a look at the example of Washington, I think it's quite interesting. How can we keep history alive? How can it be productive, a cultural history? How can we create it? How can we tell it? How can we commemorate the victims? What happened? How was it? And El Tayeb, who also talked a lot about Europe, that's the question that she posed herself, the question about racism, that is also a history. It's a story that can be displaced or displaced. Racism is always handed out to somewhere else. For example, the United States, or shortly after the reunification, racism was something that did not happen that only had happened in the former GDR. So not only the history of racism has to be reintroduced and involved in Europe, but also the geographies. So I think that there's a lot of work ahead of us, how we can express that and produce that aesthetically in our buildings. So yes, and so basically people just complicate things over and over again. You have, for example, these media projection projects. What was the word? Externalization, yes. We have the externalization that, you have to consider, we had the externalization in the post-war era, for example, when it comes to anti-imperialistic, for example, with the USA and the SS, when we suddenly had the feeling that during the Vietnam War, not the entire left-wing party said, okay, now here, these are the new Nazis. And then they were able to push their own blame to the other side of the Atlantic. And this actually triggered something that people said, oh, there's a such thing like racial profiling that does not happen only in the United States, but also here. It's a paradigm that people could not close their eyes to anymore. What happened to George Floyd and how the entire world looked at it and see it, no one could say that that did not exist any longer. So that also had political relevance here in Germany as well. So I believe that what you had just said, that this is a projection from the Western countries. You had the NSU, they're from Thuringia, we do not have anything to do with them. And that was all for former GDR. And that is not correct, because here they were very well represented and they had neo-Nazis working here in the Western states, including Bernhöcker. They are also from the west of Germany, even though they go to the east of Germany. But it is true that there is a fascist history in the GDR as well, and that there were murders that are now being brought up, and that it is a tradition there that you did have segregation. For example, the immigrants from Angola, the contract workers, yes, exactly, the contract workers. They were segregated and they were always confronted with racism. So that makes the debate so much more complicated, but I would like to nevertheless mention it, because it's something that's also always wavering out there when we're discussing about that. Maybe you want to contribute something to that. Yes, I would like to talk about something that Oliver Hart said, how to deal with right-wing spaces. And what I believe that is very important here is that we have to make things public. We need public spaces that are there for everyone. Open spaces that are there for everyone. In this summer, we had the International Public Summer School, and we did it with the Technical University here in Nuremberg and the University in Vienna, where we had representatives of the construction industry, but also from the Academy of Arts. And what we, as the association Baulust, we want to achieve is that we have an open discussion without being limited or without that anyone feels offended, because it is a topic that we are addressing this topic once again, and how we handle within the party rally grounds. We need to have a fresh look on it. We have the fresh perspective for a new generation of how you can assess the party rally grounds, how you can deal with that, and it's a process that just has to be continued. I don't think that we will get to a point where we're going to say, okay, we're done, we've finished. We have finished with the design, we have finished the discussion. I think that it's not something that is going to have an end at some point. What we also have to talk about time and time again is how to deal with the grounds in total. If you only have a look at the rally party grounds, we're only talking about a very small part that can be seen today, that can be experienced today. That's where we have the Merz field and all of the structures that are still there surrounding that field. But we have to see what is left of what happened, and we can see that every year there's less and less of the original structure. But that what is there, and which I think is very good how we have been able to deal with these grounds, is how publicly everything has been dealt with, even after the Second World War. Because before it was a People's Park, where we have the Frankenstein Stadium right now. We have all the little gardens.
And
the Dutzenteich was always an area where people went for leisure. When the party rally grounds were planned, basically this basic structure was taken over and the buildings of the Nazis were erected on top. And Albert Speer really used these basic structures and picked them up. That were this was a reason when it was a big drinking orgy. People were supposed to be experiencing themselves as part of the people's community. It was not a free space. It was not an open space, and I think that's what should be happening again. That this space opens up again. At the moment, you have the impression that everything that's happening there, either it's a sort of fun fair or a race, car race. These are fragments that are there. So this area, as a citizens' park, can't really be used. All the sports fields that existed around the football stadium, were accessible for all people. This was a car-free space, for example. And if this could be freer and more open, then I think it would be more. This would take away the aspect of the only right-wing space. And this kind of overshadows everything. And at the moment, the direction that's being taken is that it's mainly tourist. And so basically with the city of the former party rallies, and you go out there and you have to make sure that this doesn't take over completely and other aspects are completely marginalized. I always think that even if this is maybe a bit banal, in 1978 there was a Bob Dylan concert there, Bob Zimmerman playing opposite the Zeppelin Grandstand, and for this he did not use his Elvis like the garb that he wore during the rest of the tour. This gesture, he wanted to underline this gesture with a kind of bitter normality or determined normality. Well, I wanted to say something about the current initiatives in the case of the Garrison Church. There's right next to it, on the same plot, there is a sort of a computer center. It's there already. It's a computer center and it's a GDR construction, and it's supposed to be demolished because it's a GDR building. The creative scene from Fostan has moved in there, and there's a very important initiative by Philipp Oswald, the professor of architecture in Kassel, I think. And this initiative is called Learning Location Garrison Church, and there's a very extensive website talking about the Glockenspiel, about the inscriptions, about the history, and it's available on the internet and explains all this, and I think it's very important. And the entire panel against the Garrison Church, how could you deal with the Garrison Church? They're all happening 10 centimeters next to the Garrison Church. That's where it's really very, very close where this computer center is. And the initiative by Philipp Oswald is always happening in this computer center. And the website really informs very well and explains very well. Thank you very much for that. And that picks up the concept of learning location research. I said a lively experience of history and of dealing with history in this museum in Washington, D.C. Research, but also learning locations in a communicative way, as a kind of opposite of what we saw as having something that's kind of making everything look nice, and the rhetoric of covering up things. That happened quite a lot in Germany and was practiced in Germany after the war. You know, this kind of rhetoric is being picked up in other places. There's another point that I find really important, is that post-war dealing with the Nazi time in the positive as in the negative, and the mechanisms have been discovered and uncovered, but they're repeating themselves right now. I would like to ask the audience if they want to ask questions. The microphone's there. So, it's maybe a bit sudden, but you know, we've got about another quarter of an hour. There's a question there. It's something that I would like to add. When I talk about the former party rally grounds, the fact that it's been a place for where immigrants arrived, and the Congress Hall was used as a store by Quelle, and there's a lot of history of migrant and post-migrant history in this area that's written into this area as well. And my impression is that is not talked about enough, and it's kind of focusing on the time between 33 to 39 when the Nazi productions were shown there, but it was also there was also a crime site of slave labor, for example. Thank you very much. It's an important point that also applies to other places in Germany and elsewhere. That one example was named in '55. The Sudetendeutsch, the group of the Sudeten German refugees who were doing their show on the Zeppelin Tribune, including Zeppelin Grandstand, doing all the everything with Rock im Park. It's called Rock in the Park. That they have a light dome aesthetics, and these other things that you mentioned before. When we went round with Silke Meyer, we heard that some of you probably knew this, that the NSU obviously took the historic map of the Reichsparty rally grounds and projected it onto the cityscape today, and the first murder was within these party rally grounds, historic party rally grounds, and that this was not a coincidence, but that there's a dimension of picking up ideology and looking upon it as a kind of, in inverted commas, revenge for what happened after the Nazi time.
So, no, I talk too much. What do you say about this point? It is, in my opinion, very important. Maybe you can generalize it a little bit. What happens if you just encapsulate these times? For example, you can say that's from 33 to 35. That's the time we have to deal with, and that's the only thing we're focusing on. So please, go ahead. Well, I think that in any case, you also have to have a look at the circle of people who you want to involve in this discussion. You have to expand that, invite more people to come in. The rally grounds, or the former rally grounds, they are still on municipal grounds of the city of Nuremberg, but this discussion cannot and should not only be talked about in Nuremberg. They should also talk about that on all of Germany. So that's why we have to open ourselves towards allowing this participation and from outside, allowing these other perspectives. So that's why we, in some way or other, we have to seek to include the outside perspective and see what results can come from this and what can we derive from these other perspectives. And this discussion is always taken up again, and it has to be continued, how we deal with the rally grounds.
I
did understand this comment that we need a different perspective on the rally grounds, and when we have the question how the future history or architecture that we can derive from them, how can we make it without complicating it too much? And I'm not quite sure whether you have to open it up, because I think much of it is already there. And we have to shape the process in such a way that, yes, they are open, but they also show contradictions. If we have other perspectives, for example, contrary perspectives, what happens if we include this contrary perspective? If we could just put this together and condense it to one decision afterwards, that would be awesome. Because if you have, for example, a migrant or post-migrant perspective, if we could include that, meaning that we have the migration history, that in Germany they're just starting to deal with it. We have the first migration museum here in Germany. We are way behind when it comes to migratory history from Germany to Germany. Everything that has to do with our modern society. Yet we have to talk about historic negatives and also try to conceptualize them in our buildings. And I've heard the word storage and warehouse a lot here, and I think it's also a self-critical point that those who are working with this architecture, they need to reflect it more from a historic point of view. In 2015, for example, we saw that we had all the refugees coming in, and suddenly we needed to see where we could accommodate them, where they could live, and they built a lot of things for the refugees. And back then, with some students at the TU Dresden in sociology, we had a look at these plans, and we thought, well, but we have warehouse architecture, if you want to say it that way and think about it that way. It's not something that is a new German architecture. We have a history here that we have to deal with and maybe see it as a new source of apartment. It was not only, they were not talking about new apartments, they were looking at where they could accommodate all of these refugees. And we had to look at the plans. We saw that they built a building for unaccompanied minors, unaccompanied refugees. And it was more like a jail architecture. very long hallway with very small little rooms, no possibility to have a community to eat together, no living groups of 6 to 7 people, but we had 15 people on one hallway, and that there was a systematic approach to that. And when we talk about we talk about everyone who works in architecture. What are we talking about when we want to do something new, and for who, and what are the historical relationships? Now, this was in 2015, and it was kind of scary to see how we have these questions of accommodation and camps, and how are we going to deal with it in a new architecture, and what is the relationship to the historic background to that? So we have 2 questions, one on that side and one here.
Also ich engagiere mich auch kulturpolitisch.
I am also a cultural political person who is engaged in cultural and politics, and we work with the perspective for 2033 and a commemoration period until 2045. And you cannot see that as a national project of commemoration. We are demanding transnational commemoration projects, and that has been around for quite a long time. So, do you have any experiences in that field?
Ja.
Yes. And when it comes to architectural history, there have been several people who have tried to take the history of National Socialism and put it in relationship with other histories in Europe and in the world. I think it is quite important, but there's a risk that you're involving a risk by including these in this project, and we also have to think about that, yes, Mussolini and Hitler, the Italian fascism, German National Socialism, and Portugal and Spain and many other countries need to be mentioned here as well. And they have the little differences and specificities that have to be mentioned as well. We talked about multi-directional commemoration, and I believe that we have to work in an with an intersectional approach on very different levels. But when it comes to this multi-directional commemoration, it is also very important, and that's how I understand Mr. Rothberg as well. Anti-Semitism is much older than colonialism, and it should not be a reason to stay silent regarding one history or the other. And I think that is a challenge that research projects face and that we all see. This history of anti-Semitism and colonialism, we need to see both of them, we need to see the relationship between them, and we need to see the differences in the intersectional dimension, and we need to take all of this into account. Just a short comment on my side. In France, we have a right-wing candidate to the presidency who has a very good relationship to the Vichy regime, Mr. Souf. And he is ahead of Le Pen. And if you hear that, you can get kind of queasy about that. So I think this debate does have a certain urgency, but not in the sense of some relativization of specifics and the specific characteristics of the German National Socialism, but we also have to show these historical strains that are intertwined in the end. So that's why we have this multi-perspective dimension that we needed. For example, when we talk about the Second World War, and we have to look at it from the perspective of the Middle East, of Palestine, and how Israel came to be. Because multi-perspectivity, this term, and then we have the term of multidirectionality, there's what you said, that we have some space for negotiation. Multi-directional commemoration suggested that we are kind of like dealing with this together, and we're going to be able to do this in some way or another because we have people from different backgrounds and experience has shown that it's possible. But multi-perspectiveness is something different, and sometimes they can be contrary, or maybe they can just miss the point. And that's why we need to try to find a more constructive discussion. But I would like to add something to that question as well. especially considering transnational, or the question of transnational commemoration. Is it possible to think about it in one way or another? In Berlin, we have the commemoration politics project of decolonization. What is decolonization? It had 2 years of preparation time from civil society and the diaspora. That's a perspective that we're also trying to integrate. And how can you build it? How can you do that? And you also have the history of resistance. We're going to try to make that even more clear, because multi-perspectivity, you can also talk about resistance, the history of resistance. We have a specific year, and in preparation we can think about what folk history are we focusing on, and how can we decentralize perpetrator perspectives. And with these decentralized references, we can add a lot to the conversation, not only with a critical way of thinking about perpetrator history, but also have a look at the resistance history and involve that, or maybe involve the perspective of the victims. What has that meant for them in the posterior world? And then very quickly, you're at transnational perspective. Where did they go? Where are they now? What are they doing? And maybe we could involve that as well.
Another question over there. Well, I would like to make a contribution. This is being noted down. I'm interested in the equivalence between such containers and the content. Making the Zeppelin Grandstand safe to walk on costs 100 million. The Opera House is supposed to be restored for 1 billion. We could have an Elbphilharmonie on top of it, and this is what the struggles for the money for culture will be happening. My question is, how is the equivalence between erecting buildings is really expensive, and 1 billion euros for the restoration of, or 85 euros, €1 million for making the Zeppelin Grandstand safe to walk upon. So we could do 3,200 years of cultural budget for the free Nuremberg cultural scene, for the independent Nuremberg cultural scene. There was no Jesus Christ 3,200 years ago, and it's 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. This is the kind of time periods we're talking about when we're talking about these sums. We have to keep the relation between investment in building shit and basic democratic communication programs. If there was a foundation, I demand from the city, if it doesn't want to become ridiculous, that it has a Nuremberg association that looks at negotiations where every citizen can become a member, everybody who comes from the outside as well, and where these questions are debated in long sessions, and access has to be paid for it, because this couldn't be a program for volunteer work. This is not a contribution. I just want to say this for the minutes. We took it for the minutes. We have some time now. The fingers come up, but time is running out. Short questions or short statements. Excuse me. We could try to collect the questions and see what we can do. Maybe just a question to Mr. Cooking. I asked myself where these rooms, these just rooms, should be. If you look at the National Museum of African Art, when they were mentioned, where are they in Nuremberg? I couldn't think of any space in Nuremberg where you can feel you can get together with very many different people. This is a very closed circle here too for this discussion. And in these kind of discussions, there are no open rooms and there are no open spaces. I didn't think of anything in Nuremberg. Thank you. Further? Thank you very much for this discourse. I think it was great, and it's. I would still say that I miss somebody. I miss Schinkel. He was a political figure, an architectural figure. Could look at the building more. I have too little idea of the Stiftung Bauakademie, but everything is discussed here would fit in exactly there, and I would like to hear from you. Where could I look? Why is nobody from the Building Academy? Maybe you're involved in that, and how can you get more knowledge? Because I think this is really what it should be. Could we go to Stefan? Monique, please forgive me, but we really have to have these 3 questions, and your question will be discussed maybe this afternoon. Thank you very much for taking me in. When you talk about transnational commemoration, we would have the possibility of looking at the various types of fascism in Europe, but you could also take a different approach. If I look at Turkey, there's the area of the embassy in Istanbul, and there's a cemetery of the Second World War. It's not really topicalized. You don't find about a lot about the Nazi history and about artists that worked in the Nazi time that who made sculptures for this cemetery, or people like Josef Thorak, who did a bust of Ataturk. Interesting starting points to see how this transnational commemoration could look like in this kind of idea. I don't want to. The moment when the Baghdad Bahn was built in the Osmanic Empire was the beginning of deliberations of colonial colonization of the Ottoman Empire by the Germans. And this could be the starting point for a transnational commemoration. Thank you very much for this remark. It becomes very clear as an example for this. I would pick up the 2 questions that we heard, and Stefan, as a building academy, what have you to say about this? And for you, again, about the question about the open spaces in Nuremberg, whether they exist. Maybe you could start. Basically, it's what we, as Baulust e.V., have been demanding. It's that we have forums where public and open discussions about the dealing with the former party rally grounds. That doesn't exist anymore. There were Nuremberg talks at one point, and it would be desirable to repeat that regularly, and so that you can, it's also opening up this discussion so that we have a view from the outside to this situation. Because sometimes you have the impression that the discussion is completely stuck, and so that they're running against closed doors. We're working on it, and we try to revive this again and again. This was actually what the summer school was about. To have they were on the Spiegel field opposite the Congress Hall to have an exhibition there and show the student works there. And so basically to get talking to passers-by who were walking past this, and this actually was quite successful, but this was only a temporary thing, but this is the direction it should take, so that this is kind of established, so that the results are broadcast as well and carried further, and so the entire grounds are dealt with. I have a question about this. Does the city of Nuremberg have a sort of commemoration commission? No. That's what the audience says. I'm only asking because various cities. There's often about talking about street names and renaming streets, and they established commissions for commemoration. Augsburg has that, Kempten has one, and various cities. And often they starts off with names where National Socialists or colonial perpetrators, colonialists were naming streets were named after them, and then often in these cities kind of commemoration commissions are established. This won't solve the problem, but at least it could be talking about local history, what do we have here, and that could be sort of collated by this commemoration commission. If it doesn't exist, I do believe you, and if this would be this would be one absolutely concrete goal, that a concrete result of these 3 days, that should be something that's a really great idea. And so Stefan, about the building academy, this would be worth a special event of its own. I am not really part of that building academy. I have to point to the new director that was appointed. What kind of accents he will be making, what kind of focus will he be taking. It won't go to a reactionary direction, but that's my first impression. But from my point, I have been, since 1993-94, the GDR Foreign Ministry. I'm missing this. And the reconstructed Schinkel Building Academy would make the place more exciting. It seems to be, with the Building Academy, we seem to be repeating things that we already did in the Humboldt Forum. Programming will have to deal with the building and will probably fail as well in the long run. Schinkel, I think he's a great builder, but he won't save us. But as somebody, I say this as somebody who would try to get a job as a professor for the history of architecture in Stuttgart. The commemorative debates question everything. There's the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, and times which question everything that we've based our cultural self-understanding on: music, architecture, and so on. It goes through all the disciplines and fields. And when we walk through Amsterdam, and 95% of the buildings are colonialist, financed by colonialist companies. The same is true for London, Paris, and many German cities. This is the processes we're going through, and Schinkel won't be really helping us a lot in this context. We live in interesting times. I take this as a final word, but we've already exceeded our time, and I don't want to rob you of your lunch break, and us as well. I hope we'll meet again at 2 o'clock when we're talking about, with Oliver Hart, in a very concrete example, his work and his monument in Castle. Thank you very much, and see you then. And thank you very much to all here.
I'm happy to start this afternoon's session with a talk with the artist Oliver Hart, who joins us from sunny Rockville, USA this morning. Afternoon here, 6 hours later. I'm very happy that this worked out, Olu. I'll first introduce Olu and then talk briefly about the subject of our talk. It will last for maybe something between 45 minutes and an hour, including the possibility at the end, of course, to ask some questions. Olu Ogwibe is a multimedia artist whose work often straddles minimalist formalism and social engagement. His work has been widely exhibited in museum and gallery shows, as well as biennials and triennials. He has also created several public works in many countries. In 2007, his Strangers and Refugees monument, a public sculpture in Kassel, Germany, received the Arnold Bode Prize of Documenta 14. And the story goes on with that work, and I'll give a brief introduction about that story. On October 3rd, 2018, the day of German unity, and almost a year after the end of Documenta 14, the mayor of Kassel, Christian Geselle of Social Democratic Party, had an obelisk removed from the centrally located Königsplatz in Kassel. Work began at 4 a.m. in the morning on a bank holiday and was finished by lunchtime. The press, the local press, spoke of a hush-hush nighttime action, Nacht- und Nebel-Aktion, as they say in German, by the way, a phrase that the Nazis had first used. The obelisk was the artwork by Olu Ogwibe, entitled Das Fremdlinge- und Flüchtlinge-Monument, Monument for Strangers and Refugees, which had been erected there as part of Documenta 14. The obelisk bears an inscription from the Gospel of Matthäus, in Arabic, German, English, and Turkish, the languages most commonly spoken in Kassel. Quote, "I was a stranger and you sheltered me." Zitat, end of quote. The removal had come under pressure from the right-wing party AfD, or far-right party AfD, whose city councillor Materna had called it, quote, "ideologizing and distorting art." The latter formulation, distorting art, clearly alluding to the Nazis' term degenerate art. Although a private fundraising campaign had raised the funds for the purchase, a majority of Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, and the AfD decided to dismantle it nevertheless. However, after negotiations, the monument returned in April 2019 and has now been permanently installed in nearby Treppenstraße. What observations can be made based on these events? How does the artist himself analyze the situation? And now we have the chance to ask Olu himself. Olu, can you?
I can hear you, and I'll be with you in a few.
There you go. Hello, Olu. Great to see you. Just to describe the auditorium to you, there's a bunch of people here. I don't know how many exactly, but the auditorium is quite nicely filled. But of course, with all the restrictions of COVID, we all have to keep a distance, etc. People wear masks and stuff. You'll probably later see a shot of it when we come to the questions from the floor. But first of all, again,
thanks for the introduction, by the way.
Well, thanks for joining us, and let's start from the beginning, literally, going back to that moment when you were commissioned to do a work in Kassel, a city most of the people here know, probably through Documenta, and how you conceived that idea to put that work and put it up there, and with that inscription.
Right. It's a long story because over the span of my career, beginning in fact in the 1980s, I'd been making work, paintings and installations and other kinds of work that deal with historical commemoration. I actually began by making student paintings about the Biafra War, which lots of people got to hear about during Documenta because it formed part of the background of my participation in Documenta, because I made another work which was shown in Athens that was all about the Biafra Civil War in the 1960s. So in Athens, in fact, at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Athens, what I exhibited as part of Documenta was an archive of material from my own library about the Biafra War. It was called the Biafra Time Capsule. And it was quite a large installation. I may have images here which I can share later on. I had also made commemorative works, public sculptures in different countries. One of them was in Japan, where I made a large group of sculptures that commemorated, in this case, the river Shinano, the Shinano River, which used to be the largest river in Japan, and which by the time I made the work in the year 2000, had almost completely dried up because of hydroelectricity and dams and so on. A whole across Japan, there were lots of regions that actually depended on this river for agriculture, for fishing, and so on and so forth. But because of urbanization and the need for energy and so on, it was dammed to provide electricity that was in fact sent to Tokyo, several hundred miles away, and it was so much dammed that the river began to drown. So I had made all these kinds of works, and I had also used the text that eventually appeared on the obelisk. I had used that in quite a few other works and smaller works in the past. So I'd been working on that theme of flight, refuge, charity for several years in little iterations until the opportunity to make work for Documenta came up. So one of the misconceptions that people had when we made the obelisk, actually not when I proposed the work, because I did not propose an obelisk at the very beginning, but I proposed to work with that text. One of the misconceptions that people had was that the work was inspired or informed by the quote-unquote refugee crisis in 2015 in Europe and especially in Germany. But interestingly enough, quite honestly, the 2015 events in Germany and in Europe did not in any way cross my mind when I was conceiving the work for Documenta. What I had in mind, what inspired that work in the earlier form that I had conceived of it, what really inspired it was something else from the history of the region, from the history of Hesse and Castle. And it's this document which I'll try to share right now. It's this particular document here, which is the Edict of Castle from 1685. In the course of my research into the region and into the history of the city, I chanced upon this document, and I found it very interesting because it sort of dovetailed into the theme that I was dealing with. The very fact that as far back as 1685.
Sorry to interrupt you. Just to say that the screen sharing shows us only a section of that document.
Right.
Yeah.
And it looks. It doesn't look very sharp, does it?
Well, we can read. Well, the problem is that it only shows a kind of smaller section, not the whole page. I don't know the reason for that, but well, we can see that it was the Freiheitskonzession und Begnadigung, the concessions of privileges from 1685. Anyway,
yeah.
But maybe go on and tell us what that document sort of manifested for you in regard to the work you were then about to conceive?
Yeah, it basically gave me the necessary background to return to the question of providing refuge. And it sort of said to me that Castle had a history of providing refuge, and a history that went back earlier than several other European cities. And I actually wanted to revisit that. I'm not in any cynical kind of way, and not in any ironic kind of way, but it just seemed to align with the biblical passage about providing refuge. So in other words, the work that I was proposing was in fact a commemoration of the Edict of 1685. But that was not the line that went out to the public, or the line that the public was particularly interested in. And I think somehow in the course of interviews and discussions, the fact that I had been a refugee as a child in the Biafra war, that got into the media, and people empathized with that much more than thinking about an invocation or commemoration of the Edict of Castle, or the idea that the work was about the history of Castle. I think it was much more fascinating and compelling for people to think in terms of, oh, this artist has this history and experience of refuge, and therefore that's why he's interested in this. But that's not necessarily, the part of my participation in Documenta that was inspired by the Biafra experience was the Biafra time capsule that we installed in Athens. So now, so this is the background. In fact, is that, and I remember that Adam Zimczyk, who was the, of course, the artistic director of Documenta 14, he'd also been very fascinated by the experience of the French in Castle and Hessen, when they had the conflict between Austro-Hungarian Empire and the French, and how at that time the French were not welcome in especially Castle. So we kind of talked about those differences, and for me, I try to project forward also to what I saw as a different kind of irony, because here you had Castle with this history, which is almost medieval at this point, but you also had the castle that expelled its Jewish citizens during the World War. So, and now you had the castle that, when it was called to my attention, the 2015 events, you had a castle that was now divided, but where the majority of the people supported the gestures to welcome immigrants. As you and I know, that would eventually have fatal consequences later on, when Mr. Lübeck was assassinated or murdered. I think that was in 2000. Wasn't that in 2019 or 2018? It was, yeah. Yes.
That's a very profound connection you're making there to this murder of Walter Lübcke. Just a technical thing. Maybe you want to stop sharing the screen for now so we can see you again. I think it's good for the audience to see you talk. And I just want to come back to this fascination with the Les Huguenots, I don't know how you pronounce them in English, the French who had to flee France because they were Protestants, and the Catholic royalties went after them, and they had to, a concessional war in a way, or not a really war, but a kind of expelling of the Protestants. In the wake also of the 30-year War and so on. And by the way, the same happened in other cities of Germany as well, in Berlin and Frankfurt and so on. And to draw these historic parallels in terms of, well, the parallels and the differences. And I wondered how that also informed the aesthetic you chose, because what struck me was, or what still strikes me is that you could say in a way that you were probably purposely choosing an aesthetic that is very much in line. For example, in one of the most famous obelisks is in France to basically commemorate Napoleon's Egyptian War, you know, this kind of colonial expansion of France under Napoleon, and these kind of expansionist wars, and obelisks often signify this kind of triumphal gesture. And you take the obelisk and you take golden letters and you take a quote from the Bible and all these elements that could be described at first sight, or in maybe naively even, as somehow being even conservative or something, but then something happens that the conservatives don't seem to like. Can you explain to us how that came about?
Definitely. That's also very ironic. And it sort of speaks to the way in which, obviously, we make public art and the long processes that are involved, and how, in the context of an exhibition like Documenta, where there is limited time from the period when you commissioned or approached to propose an idea to realizing it, how that's very different from if you were to make a public art for the municipality. You might have a longer period to go through those processes. But with an exhibition like Documenta, you literally have very limited time. In my case, I was invited in 2016. And to be quite honest, like I said, initially, I did not propose to make an obelisk. That was not part of the proposal. What I had proposed to do is to use that text and the background and stories around it, but to present it, in fact, I wish that I had the image to share now, but to present it as just letters, a sculpture of just text. And the place that I proposed to put that was actually at the central train station in Castle, not at the Königsplatz, where we eventually ended up making the obelisk. But then, as often happens with public art in the context of an exhibition where there are multiple sites, we had great difficulty getting the approvals, municipal approvals, to do that kind of very large scale text sculpture at the train station. Now, I don't know whether that was just for safety reasons or for technical reasons, or whether right from the beginning there were political elements of political resistance involved, but we just made no progress whatsoever with that idea. So opening was June 2017. By November or even December of 2016, we didn't know whether we were going to make it work or not. We had to start from scratch. So when I was in Athens doing site visits for my participation in Athens, we then discussed, what were we going to do about Castle, in terms of my work there. And it was in the course of discussing this between myself and Adam and some of the other staff. We had a little meeting in a cafe in Athens, and it was there that I then said, listen, since we're not making progress, I have an old idea to make a public sculpture using an obelisk. The old idea had no text. It was not about Castle. It was not about Documenta. It was for a totally different project, which did not work. But I can imagine an obelisk in the Königsplatz, and obelisks are popular. As arcane and conservative as they are, people just love them, which is why you actually have them in burial grounds and graveyards. People just love Europeans, I think, more than others. Do like the idea of the obelisk as a monumental representation of the power of the municipality. And when I put that forward, it caught on very quickly. With the text sculpture that I was going to make, it was going to be literally in just German, because that's the nature of the text sculpture. I did not have it in several different languages, perhaps English, but most, it was probably just going to be in German. Now, the obelisk provided 4 different surfaces on which to position translations of this text in those 4 most widely spoken languages in Castle. So it was more or less a win-win situation. And then it came with all the other historical associations in terms of colonialism, in terms of the relationship between the French and Africa. So it wasn't initially intended, but once we had the obstacles and we needed a solution, it became a very successful solution to the problem of what do you put in a public space that commands attention, but also serves the purpose of putting across these particular ideas. And I think that the association with the Huguenot became even more apt because of the location of the work that we eventually made. Because obviously the Königsplatz in Castle was designed by an architect of Huguenot ancestry. In fact, he was a second generation Huguenot in Castle. And it was made more or less as a gesture of gratitude to the city and to I forget what they were called anyway, the government that brought the Huguenot to Capsule. So that other association, and if you're in the Königsplatz in Castle, you can look directly at the church, the Huguenot church in Castle. You can see it right from the Königsplatz. So all these associations became very useful. And it's being a central place where lots of people in Castle, the locals, the natives, the immigrants, refugees, and everyone comes to the Königsplatz at some point. Even church masses are held at the Königsplatz on some occasions. And you have the Christmas market which is very, very popular. In fact, several 100,000 people come to the Christmas market at the Königsplatz every year. So it just seemed to be a very appropriate and, if you like, lucky spot to position that work. So, again, this speaks to the element of chance in the process of making public art.
I wonder how clear it was by that point when you conceived this sort of joining together of these two ideas, that earlier idea of the obelisk and the idea of the inscription, how clear it was by that point whether it would become a permanent installation, because obviously it makes a huge difference whether you say, oh, well, this will be up for 100 days, or might be up for 100 years or longer, or even just 10 years or whatever. But in terms of this question, which is always a little precarious in Kassel, I guess, and similarly, for example, at the Skulpturprojekte in Münster, where at the outset it's not always quite clear which of the works will permanently stay and which of the works will only be there temporarily. Was that question on your mind? Was it discussed already at that point? Or when did it become clear that the aim was to install it permanently?
I think it sort of was in the background because I believe that Adam was very keen on making something that had some permanence, right? It wasn't necessarily central in my mind, but it was broached by Adam that we should think in terms of the possibility. And I think that once we began to think of an obelisk, it began, I think that idea began to percolate, because an obelisk is usually something that is permanent until someone removes it and takes it to a different place, as was the case with the obelisks from Egypt, which were brought to Europe. So permanence began to enter the discussion at that point. And these things happen very quickly because people sort of tend to rally around it. And I think that it just happened that the people who eventually objected to the presence, the long-term presence of this work, I don't think that at that point they were part of the discussion, because there actually ought to be some element of autonomy in those decisions up to the point where the city council steps in. That usually happens afterwards, but the element of autonomy that allows the artistic director and the organizers of Documenta to project into the future in terms of what might be retained. I think that has always been part of the history of Documenta, and it's that element that then brings Documenta and certain sections of the public into conflict. And I believe in 2006 or so, the right-wing party had also sued Documenta. So this, we did not necessarily anticipate that there was going to be the kind of conflict that eventually developed. But all of these things were, floating in people's minds. For me personally, I think the concentration was on the fact that we had literally 6 months to go from the final decision to make the obelisk to realizing the work, and that's a very limited time with a lot of pressure, and I was keen to deliver something that met especially the expectations of Adam Timtik and the curators.
I was wondering, to go one step further in that time frame towards now, I guess there was also some ruminations already going on during the 100 days in Castle, but then it seemed to erupt even more fiercely afterwards, right? There was a kind of attack on the documented team. There were attempts to smear them as being sort of corrupt or wasting taxpayers' money and so on, and because there had been troubles in transferring money to Athens to pay the bills there, and all this story. I don't need to repeat all these stories, but it created a certain, let's say, to say the least, a very polarized and very fiercely politicized and ideologized discussion around the whole question, very much also pushed by the far right and by far right populist perspectives in terms of, basically tying into very old resentments against art. It's a waste of taxpayers' money, it's an imposition on the ordinary citizen, and it's some kind of lefty imposition on the normal public, right? And suddenly you found yourself right in the midst of all that. How did that affect you, or how did you feel you want to deal with it?
Well, first off is that that conversation mostly exploded after the opening. So the work was already in place. I do have to admit that before the opening, people knew there was going to be an obelisk in the Königsplatz as part of Documenta. In fact, the work was orchestrated with generating anticipation in the public by the documented team. So, there was silence around it, there was secrecy, and then there was a public announcement that there was going to be this work in the Königsplatz, and people were interviewed on camera, and there was a lot of enthusiasm toward having an obelisk in the Königsplatz as part of Documenta. But nobody in the public, I don't think, knew that this text was going to be part of it. It wasn't marketed, the text wasn't marketed as much as the form itself. So that, and we put the text on by the time we arrived to the engineering and construction and so on, to putting the text on. It was like only a few days before the opening. In fact, we had some setbacks with the text because it wasn't very legible, and we had to scramble around and decide on the gold leaf treatment to make it legible. That's actually how the gold came around, was to make it legible. We put up the text, the color was such that it wasn't legible from even the short distance. And we had, I believe, 3 days or so to the opening. So I thought, how are we going to make it legible? And we decided to put in that gold leaf. So anyways, it was at that point with the text on and with all that it evoked in people's minds. And that context that I hadn't thought about at the beginning, which is the events of 2015, that then began to rile people. So it wasn't until August, which was about 2 months or so after the opening, that the IFD made their statement about the work being distorted. So I had written texts about public art, and I taught seminars about public art, and I'd made public art in different countries. So not only was I used to engaging the public space in that manner, but I had actually also engaged the discourse of what can happen when you make an intervention in the public space in graduate seminars and in publications that I'd written in the past. So it was something that I could not only anticipate, but also handle very easily within the politics that then came about. And I think that there are lots of things that we began to anticipate once the orchestrated campaign to tarnish the reputation of Documenta 14. Once that got going, we could anticipate all these other things that came around it, including the opposition to acquiring the work. Because obviously, how the work becomes permanent is that it gets acquired. So these things began to play one into another. I don't know if that actually addresses the question.
Yes, it does. I was wondering, okay, the next step. We have this unfolding, let's say, disaster of a social democratic mayor joining ranks with the far right to prevent a work from being installed or getting it deinstalled and making the disaster even worse by doing so on the day of German reunification, which is like really absurd in itself. But then the discussion didn't end, apparently. And there was some kind of, there must have been, let's say, a kind of back channel to the authorities in Kassel, to some, I mean, classic diplomacy even, in a way, to get them back on course at least a little bit. How did that work out? I mean, you don't need to spill all the secrets here, but it would be really interesting to get an idea how you and maybe supporters of your work, whether it's from the Kassel team, people like Bonaventure Ndikung and Chimchik and other people, and you, of course, yourself, managed to keep that back channel running and create a discussion that, to cut a long story short, eventually led to the work being reinstalled. But let me know how that back channel came into place in the first place and how it could be used to keep the discussion going about the destiny of that piece.
Yes, I think, not just that particular work, but you're very right to bring that up, because that would apply, hopefully, in such circumstances, for any artist who happens to find themselves in similar situations. First off, it ought to be mentioned that the majority of people in Kassel wanted to keep the work. So it wasn't even 50-50. It was just a question of a very vocal minority opposing keeping the work. And when it became clear that the work might be kept in Kassel, they shifted the opposition to keeping the work where it was meant to be, or where it was made to fit, as a political strategy for eventually, hopefully, getting the artist to decide that if the work cannot remain where it was made to fit, therefore I would withdraw the work. That was a calculation of the far right. was that eventually I would withdraw the work if they succeeded in preventing us from keeping it at the Königsplatz. But you have to remember, I'd also been in politics a long time. I had a position in a national political party when I was 16 years old, when I couldn't vote. I was a local agent for a national political party in Nigeria when I wasn't old enough to vote. And I was a student leader, and I was a pro-democracy activist for many years, not just in Nigeria, but in the UK as well. So I do have considerable experience in tackling political issues. And I had support from the community. I had support from the local documenter support organization, because there's a group in Castle that is dedicated to supporting documenter. They were very supportive. I had support from some of the political parties as well. I had support from the Greens. I had support from the Left Party. I had a lot of support from members of the SD as well, even if those of them who were involved in the municipal council weren't necessarily upfront about their support, but many of them were very supportive. And I would dare to say that Mayor Gisele was himself torn between his position on the personal position on the work and the exigencies, if you like, of maintaining his job. He'd already been corralled, I think, into all the snafu around taking Adam and Documenta to court and so on and so forth. And so somehow he'd been channeled into that difficult situation, which he took up rather enthusiastically. But I as someone with political experience, I could tell that he was doing that to protect his job rather than because he believed in it. So we had constant exchange between myself, and I have to mention that I had support from a gallery in Berlin, and they were with me.
Gallery, yeah.
Yes, I involved them in the discussions at the mayor's office and with the mayor. I was leading, I have to say, but having their backing did make some difference. So yeah, the most important thing was that at that point there was already a sense of communal, or rather community, a community sense of ownership around the work. A large portion of the community wanted the work. And that's when your hand is strengthened in that manner, it makes it easier to navigate opposition. But at the back of my mind also, I needed, and I made this obvious eventually when we decided to keep the work. At the back of my mind, there were a number of goals that I needed to attain with the work. I can tell you now that there was a lot of, there were lots of suggestions to not bow to the pressure from the right, rather to not allow the city to have its way, or if it did, to withdraw the work. There were people who proposed that I should send the work to the airport, and there were actually members of the community who had businesses that approached us and offered to take the work and put it in front of their business and so on and so forth. And there were the hardliners for whom it was a matter of either or. Either we kept the work at the Königsplatz, which is the site-specific spot, or we withdraw the work. And there was a lot of support in terms of where it might go outside the country. But you know, having been in this business for a long time, I was very realistic about some of those suggestions, because some of them were coming from people who have no experience with making work in the public space or with dealing with the challenges of finding a future for that kind of work. So I had to be careful in navigating the sentiments between our opposition and the feelings of people who felt that because we were also dealing with protecting the artist's right in the right to free expression and the theme or subject of site specificity, that we should not compromise. At the back of my mind, number one, I actually wrote those down and listed them. As we were doing all these, going through all these experiences, I had those final goals listed and written down so that they could guide me in my decisions, so that I didn't make any, so that I wasn't prompted into making decisions that would sabotage the final goal. It was important for me to help realize what I mentioned earlier on about Adam having an idea that we ought to strive to make a work that's important enough to keep it as part of documented history in Castle. I felt that if we, for the reasons of opposition, failed to attain that goal, then obviously the opposition had won. Like I said, you know, their strategy was to find a way to get us to withdraw the work from Castle. That was number one. And number two was to use the opportunity to also go back to stuff that I had written in texts about public art, which is to say that you have to take into consideration the sentiments of the public, either or, those in support and those against, and you know that you can't simply intervene in other people's public spaces without some element of contribution from that public. And that doesn't, you know, that role is delegated in contexts like exhibitions such as Documenta. The public contribution that would be part of any public art in a municipal space in ordinary circumstances is delegated to the curator who makes decisions with the rest of the curators and the management of Documenta, and then presents that to the city. So elsewhere, you might have a long, extended exchange between the artist with their ideas and the community with their input, and before you finally arrive at a municipal public art. And in this case, it's not always the case. You know, I mean, the city council does have a say, obviously, and the mayor does have a say, obviously, but the initial decisions are delegated to those that ought to have that right of decision in the context of an exhibition. So it's a long-winded response to your question, but I had a goal in mind.
Yes.
To not let the right deny us keeping the work in Castle under any circumstances.
I think it's totally important to understand these negotiations because they are kind of paradigmatic for a lot of occasions regarding public art, and that's why I asked, and then you gave a very precise answer. That's fantastic. So before I open to the floor, one last question, maybe more briefly now. Now that the obelisk has been reinstalled in Treppenstraße, you lost the site specificity of Königsplatz. Treppenstraße, I would say, is still a quite prominent place because it's always been, that's the place where people often walk towards Fridericianum to see Documenta, right? It's one of those, that's right. The Treppenstraße, which is a kind of a residential, a kind of shopping area of Kassel and so on. So it's quite a prominent place still. So short answer, are you, well, happy is maybe the wrong word, but are you satisfied with that outcome?
Yes, you know, the most fascinating thing is that the work, because it touched something in the public conscience and consciousness, generated an afterlife that is the dream of any artist who works in the public space. In terms of the discussions, in terms of the opposition, in terms of the opportunity to revisit issues like site specificity and the, you know, perennial question of freedom of expression in Germany, and, you know, the subject of centrality and the contest for space. All of these things came up in those and the discussions, you know, weren't just between myself and the gallery. As you know, it wasn't just between myself, the gallery, and the city. It was members of the public. It was the community staging protests in support of the work, having picnics around the work, and you know, that I'm told that it's the most concerted and most vigorous discussion around a documentary piece since Joseph Beuys made his work in the 70s. So that in itself, even if we'd lost the effort to keep the work in Castle, that in itself was very satisfying. But yes, the new location, which is very close to the Königsplatz, has now also generated life. The work has generated new life in that location, and I would like to share just one image very quickly, if that's okay, as to some of the kind of uses that the work has been put to after all that happened around the conflict.
And while you share the image, I'll ask the audience to raise their hand in case of a question.
Sure. So I don't know if you can see. Can you see the obelisk?
Yeah, we see the image now.
Okay. So this was an event that there's a group in Germany, but they also have a branch in Hesse and in Kassel that supports the rescue of immigrants from the high seas. And this was one of their meetings. And as you can see, you know, they used the background of the obelisk to stage this public installation and also have this meeting. And so many such events have happened around the site of the obelisk. Very recently, there was an exhibition at this site on the Treppenstraße around the obelisk, an exhibition of people who, I believe these were either survivors or family members. Okay, I think these are actually people who have been targeted by the far right across Germany, different private citizens who, for one reason or another, have appeared on the blacklist of the AfD and the far right, and some of these violent short lists of people they want to attack, either physically or otherwise. So there was an exhibition of the faces, because it's one thing to hear about it, it's a different thing to actually maybe see your neighbor is on that list, or a relative is on that list. There was an exhibition of photographs of those citizens, and it was held around the site of the obelisk. So that's one example of the new life that it has assumed, and it's on what the city ostentatiously refers to as the documenta sculpture walk. So I believe they'll have tours at some point where they introduce people to all the different.
Sorry to interrupt you, but there's suddenly a much diminished quality of the microphone, of your sound. I don't know what the reason might be, but there suddenly was a kind of distorted, more lower sound. Don't worry.
Nein, machen Sie sich keine Sorgen.
That's the answer. I mean,
Yeah. So
we can see.
Maybe
I'll turn off the screen sharing now.
Ich werde dann aufhören, meinen Bildschirm zu teilen. Ja, aber das Publikum kann gerne Fragen stellen. Wir haben nicht sehr viel Zeit, wir sind wieder über der Zeit, aber ein paar Fragen wären möglich.
Also. Da hebt sich eine Hand hier links. There's a hand raising over there.
Hi, ich spreche.
I'm going to be speaking German, but I think there will be translation for you. Okay.
Go ahead.
Aus, sagen wir mal,
From
literaturhistorischer Perspektive,
literature history, seen from the literary history, this piece.
Ist der Matthäusspruch auf Ihrem Obelisken erinnert mich?
So is this quote from the Gospel of St. Matthew reminds me of Novalis, which was very important in Germany. Was I moved in as a foreigner and I moved out as a foreigner.
Die Winterreise von Franz Schubert über.
That went into songs by Franz Schubert and into restoration in the 19th century. And to give this romantic idea of the stranger coming in to write this as a Bible text, I think you hit a nerve there. Because
sozusagen Genese von Nationen,
you see the genesis of nation and you see the genesis of a romantic idea of the nation, and so that this stranger in this image confronts this Bible text and confronts us with the Bible text. I could imagine that you hit a nerve there.
So the question or the observation which leads to a question is that there's also another connotation of the terminology from the Matthew Bible quote, because in German Fremdling or der Fremde, the stranger, A has a kind of exoticizing a sort of romanticizing history in literature. The questioner, Sarah Kahn, she mentioned as an example Novalis, the German romantic poet and writer, who had a phrase, this is not a poetic translation, but as a stranger I came, and as a stranger I left, which kind of romanticizes this idea of the stranger, the other, which is a very typical 19th century motif. And then she says, well, maybe the use of that Bible phrase struck literally a nerve with many Germans who sort of are struggling with their own understanding of what they mean with that word. And there's of course also, I might add, in German already a history of criticizing the very term of making, for example, describing, instead of saying racism, people say fremdenfeindlich, for example, you know, which is a kind of diminishing or a euphemization of the fact that these people, they or we are here, you know, that this kind of othering works through the word itself. So to phrase it in more succinct terms, do you think that kind of history of the word itself and its kind of romanticization in the romantic German literature and so on, Kassel also being the city of the Grimm brothers, had also a role in this? Sorry, we don't hear you. I think you have to turn on your sound again.
Thank you. Yes, I was saying that, of course, I couldn't speak to that because I'm not familiar with that, that particular history. But that's a possibility. I think there was also a lot of resonance for people from the, if you like, refugee or migrant community. I remember, because we got lots of individual stories, of course, people, you know, sent us messages and so on. But I also remember a colleague, one of the staff of Documenta, had gone to a hair salon at the Königsplatz, which happened to be operated by Turkish German owners. And the young women there were saying that they had never imagined that they would see a work like that with Turkish on it. You know, that they had to pinch, you know, that they had to pinch themselves and say, is that Turkish we see there on that work? In other words, people from the migrant community identified with the workers as well. So that's the historical association in literature is possible. And of course, that's a little problematic because the idea of the other is exactly what the work sets out to problematize, because it's the moment they received into the home, the idea is that the home becomes their home, at which point they should cease to be strangers. And as you know, Germany is and the rest of Europe struggling with that question now. Personally, I have certain reservations around the manner in which the government deals with it. There's this obsession with integration, but at the same time, that there are all sorts of policies and programs and so on to sort of supposedly help people better integrate. There's also a constant reference to them as migrants. That, you know, you can't generation after generation continue to refer to members of certain communities as migrants, and at the same time expect integration, or in fact blame them for not integrating. You have to break down the barriers, and one way of doing that is probably not to constantly talk about integration and migrants and migrant communities and migrant. That term comes up so often in European, not just in Germany, but across Europe in daily policy, government policy and stuff. There has to be, I think, in the United States, we've probably sort of gone a little farther, and I suppose that's because it's a much larger country together, and certain communities have been able to transcend the barrier of being constantly referred to as migrant communities. The Italian community in America is no longer referred to as a migrant community. The German community used to be a migrant community, but you know they've long ceased to be a migrant community. We still have a few others that hopefully will transcend that. And that it's important for integration to work that communities are not put on the outside as migrants or refugees. You know, at some point they have to be accepted as being, as you said, already being here, you know, and therefore part of the society and the community.
This last point you made kind of makes me want to ask one last question. I think we really have to end there then because we're running over time. But I wanted to ask you, because I was thinking, as you just mentioned, you're living in the US. I mean, there is a famous monument associated with immigration and receiving the stranger and welcoming them home, which is the Statue of Liberty, which also has the famous poem that all of the lost refugees of the world, I can't recall it in Proverbia, but you know what I mean, the famous poem which basically says, yes, come to me, all you lost souls, all you, the ones who've been sent away from their home country or had to flee. Does that resonate with you, or do you think it's actually an old myth or lie?
It does, and I since last year I've had a fellowship with the Open Society, and one of the works that I actually proposed to make was to use that section of the poem from the Statue of Liberty about, you know, give me your poor, your wretched, and your weary, and you know, and the fact that as a nation, from a policy point of view, but also from the actions of certain citizens, especially along the borders, we actually contradict the spirit of that gesture of give me your poor, give me your wretched, so on, and they will be welcome and protected. We haven't been living up to that as a society and a nation. So it resonates for me, and it's something that I've been meaning to make public work actually around. So yeah, you're right.
Olo, thank you so much. I think everyone here also really enjoyed the talk as much as I did. Have a nice day in Rockville, USA. I hope it remains sunny. See you soon.
Thanks for having me. I'm sorry that I didn't share lots of images, but we had so much to talk about too. Yeah. You know, so I'm grateful to everyone who. Yeah, I'm grateful to everyone who made it, and I regret that I wasn't able to be there in person and to catch up with lots of friends. I have friends from Castle who are actually there also, I think, for the conference. And I'll be in Germany soon.
Okay.
So thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Ja, wir machen jetzt eine ganz kurze 5-minütige Pause, also eine Zigarettenpause oder auch Kaffeepause, nennen Sie es wie Sie es wollen, aber nicht zu lange, weil ich sage es auch gleich, wir machen eine kurze Schlussrunde, aber ich sage es auch ganz ehrlich, mein Zug fährt um 17:05 Uhr. Ich muss irgendwann auch mal wieder nach Berlin, morgen muss ich unterrichten. Insofern freue ich mich, wenn wir die Pause relativ kurz halten und dann eine relativ kurze Closing Session hier machen. Bis gleich.
Small cigarette, small cup of coffee, and then we'll come back for the final discussion.
Der Tag schreitet voran. Wir kommen zur Schlussrunde, die jetzt auch bewusst improvisiert gehalten ist, dass wir einfach nochmal gemeinsam schauen auf die 3 Tage zurück, was uns so an Punkten vielleicht aufgefallen ist oder Punkten, die
that we noticed or things that we thought were important.
I'm going to inevitably switch between languages because Monique certainly prefers to make her statement or her observations in English, and I'll start with Monique. I'll introduce you others again for those who haven't been there yesterday or the day before. Again, to be clear, but Monique, as she will have to leave in like 10 minutes to the airport, we really love to hear what your takeaway, as the English say, is from these 3 days. What are the things where you thought, wow, this is something that makes me think, gives me food for thought, something that prompts me to develop an idea further?
Yes, the intensity of the contestation over the public sphere, I think it is something that aesthetic theory has not yet quite come to terms with. At the same time, I am struck by the fruitfulness of the idea that, you know, we need art in order to figure out what public space can be. But then the art, of course, needs the public space in order to help this public space figure out what it can be. So you have this intense mutual vulnerability. And I think as long as we keep our eyes on that mutual address between public and art and audience, as long as we keep our eyes on that, we can keep thinking the aesthetic, because I also noticed that the aesthetic dimension sometimes disappears, like when we start talking about right-wing spaces, or when we go into these extensive processes of debate over artworks and the worry about the destruction. Sometimes the aesthetic dimension disappears a little bit. Of course, it's always there, and it's importantly and powerfully there. It doesn't go away, but sometimes we talk in a way that distances it a little bit, like when it becomes an issue of a certain regressive appeal to beauty decontextualized in the sense that Oliver was talking about, or if it becomes a kind of in the sense someone else from the decolonial perspective was talking about, Professor Hart was talking about, then if we bring in that complex aesthetic, what I call aesthetic history of coloniality, by looking primarily at the question of who is who enters the public space, who is in the public space, at those moments the aesthetic can disappear a little bit in its full richness, right? Because it becomes beauty in some narrow sense, or it becomes, we start thinking about history and identity and politics in a way where we lose a little bit track of aesthetic powers. So I found it particularly poignant to keep articulating and to keep thinking about the aesthetic in that mutuality of what I call address, in that mutuality of address between people and objects, and that mutuality of address also between public spaces, which have their aesthetic, and their current public spaces, and these aesthetic histories that they are in conversation with. So if you have those layers of address going, those structures of address going, which goes a little bit beyond the idea of plurality or inclusiveness or a multiplicity of memory, if you keep the focus on that, then I think the aesthetic doesn't need to disappear when we're talking about the politics, but it's really powerfully present as connected with identity and as a site of the politics, where the politics also is a site of aesthetics, so you have that duality. So that would be my comments. Mm-hmm. I'm happy to hear criticisms of this.
No, I think it's quite, my first reaction would be that I immediately have to think of what Olu Ogwibe just talked about, this difficult diplomatic, let's say, negotiation where the aesthetic is on the verge of disappearing, literally, in terms of a battle over representation where something is placed. But then we think again, I think site specificity itself is an aesthetic category, or has become one in more pronounced terms. So even when we think it might not really deal with the actual aesthetics of a work, it still at least with one aspect of it, like in this case, where is it actually placed in the end? And we have similar discussions here in Nuremberg where something is placed. You know, a monument, for example, or where in the rally grounds something, not necessarily an object, but in terms of like an intervention into that space actually occurs. And this question of periphery versus center in that sense, like is something central in the community where people cannot avoid it or do not want to avoid it, hopefully also, where, as opposed to something that is kept to the periphery, literally out of sight, you know. So that would be my take on that aspect, that this, and I also would take still your statement as a call for simply not forgetting about that aesthetic dimension when getting sort of drawn into these more political discussions or negotiational levels.
Yeah, so the where has changed, the site specificity has changed in the course of the process because the community has changed in part because for that reason the site specificity has changed. At the same time, we were not really talking about, you know, how that precisely works with the gold lettering and the shape of the obelisk. I think Sarah's question drew a little bit attention to this dynamic of the word of the stranger, but I totally agree with you that an intervention has taken place, but it did become a bit of a narrative. I'm pushing the point now just to see how far it can go, and I'm not sure if it can go very far, but it did become a bit of a narrative that did not really resonate with how that sculpture is working aesthetically. But maybe it is because its forms are then playing into a whole different kind of public sphere. So that's where we then need to find that aesthetic dimension. Of course, not in the formal aspects. But still I had the sense, you know, we need to be talking about this in connection with precisely, or maybe the sense of the people that their aesthetic space is being taken over, and so they want to push that sculpture out. So aesthetically, the obelisk became something to be estranged from the place itself. So maybe you came, the sculpture became, in a sense, I'm just playing here, became the quote-unquote stranger, had been made into a stranger by the public space, and then the public space took it back in. So yeah, to talk about this, for example, and to have this real spatiality and this spatial process, emotional, affective process there, that would be further to bring in the aesthetic dimension, I would say. But interesting point.
Absolutely, and that's a thought that I take as another takeaway today, that the work itself, by being in a force field, sort of performs the very question it addresses. Yeah, absolutely. Very good point. Thank you. Maria, do you want to say something?
Sure. I would also maybe depart from where you left it. Thank you. I would like to also depart on the mutuality or the shared vulnerability and how to think about this as thinking about the public space beyond the binary of the periphery and the center, and how the Entinstitutionalisierung der Kunst would be a role to take, not only politically but also aesthetically, and how decentralized spaces for political awareness and an awareness towards the racial, gender, and discrimination, the struggles that are born from that need to also take place beyond the Rathaus, and how the city is as responsible for that. I was thankful for for your remarks across the last 3 days, but also what Noah Ka was saying about to not only look into what is there, but also the need to find those places to give for a Forschungszentrum maybe for the struggles, and not to keep it on the Opferrolle, I guess. And I think, and also this could be attached to what Olu also said. Can we transcend the border of being only the migrant? Can we transcend the border of being a victim? And I think that also goes beyond, can we think about public space beyond identity politics? And this could be essential for the next steps to take in order to stop polarization of it, because I guess this is where the meaning of public art should go, aesthetically and politically. The first day of the symposium, I had the chance to talk about, or at least to draw attention to the interchangeable responsibilities between aesthetical and political practices in the production of art and in the care labor that it's being produced or is manifesting towards this. And I think that public art as a definition and as a discipline can still be taken as, well, I think as an emancipation tool for collectivities and individuals, if we think about urgencies entangled to governmental fundings that are being thought of. Well, now we have to do a symposium on the development of cities, but what about if the urgencies are put in the middle and these spaces can be also found somewhere else? Not to say that this is not as relevant as it can be. It is, and the documentation of it will also show the echoes of the conversations taking place here. But we can see also the limitations of formats like panels, as we saw in the panels that we had with Zoe Claire Miller, Simon Fujiwara, and Cassie Thornton, who with completely different practices can also show how in the gaps of political activism and art practice can be found the awareness of political discourses that are difficult to easily understand or reflect upon, recognize in practices that apparently are only happening in the discursive bubble. And I think this is something I would like to take on, and I would like also to think what Zoe Claire Miller found out of the kind of conversations we just had upon this.
Before you answer, I think Monique has to leave. Thank you so much, Monique.
Thank you, Monique.
Ciao, Monique.
And I know the translators hate that, but in order to allow you to enter the conversation here in the space, if it's okay, we switch to German now again, if that's okay.
Wenn das in Ordnung ist.
I give a warning here, so we're going back to German now. Wir machen es jetzt wieder auf Deutsch weiter, damit es auch für das...
And I'm going to continue speaking in German now, so it's easier for the audience to participate as well. Zoe. Yes, that's wonderful, because all my notes, I've been taking them in German. So this is Zoe Clay Miller. She was on Monday. No, she... we've been doing this symposium for a long time. It seems like a longer time, but we had a panel discussion with Zoe on Friday, and Monique, and the ones who are here, we've been here this entire 3 days, so that's why. Zoe, please go ahead. Yes, well, I thought it was quite interesting and exciting to be here and to be able to listen to all of the lectures and presentations. And I do think it's quite important, especially considering the specificity of the location, to have a symposium as this happening in Nuremberg, where we have most of the NSU attacks, they happened here in this city, but we also have the racism of the pharmacies, or, for example, the Christian anti-Semitism of the church. I gathered some information, and I thought it was great that we had free entrance and that people who were very spontaneous could still participate. Nevertheless, it is still an elitarian space where lots of people who work with maintenance and they have not participated. They might have been interested in these topics. So when we did the critical walk with Birgit Meyer, I thought that was incredibly enriching and very interesting. Also Tanja Feldman's presentation, Ibrahim Aslan, who are survivors of racist attacks. And this interface between education work and discourses where you have on a very personal level on the other hand. And I think that accessibility is also a very problematic word. By opening these discourse to everyone, even though if they're academic, even to people who are not in academia, I think that is something that is very important to do. And that's something that we have to keep on considering for public art so it can be effective. My project, for example, the one that I presented on Friday, the exorcising Reiku, there we have people doing that who are not artists themselves, and we're trying to involve them by addressing critical political topics as well. For example, capitalism and its secondary effects, intolerance, criminalism, turbo-capitalism, techno-federalism. We were trying to exercise this by creating objects and firing them in a ceramics oven, which, of course, can be questionable and complicated. We were not able to exhibit these works before we went to their authors. It was financed by Julia Staszek with her background and Mariam Otto with her Nazi background and her participation in the intolerant cupola of the Humboldt Forum to see it as a sculpture, to make a sculpture, and was exercised as well in this work group of more than 60 participants. And I also feel a little bit intimidated because there's so many academics here, people who have been discussing this for such a long time. I'm more a practical person. I'm from an artistic background. I work with my hands, and I know more about the syndicalized work, for example, and come from Berlin, from other activist areas. And I believe that within this discourse, it is very important to look at how you can have anti-racist activist perceptions and perspectives in public art as well, how you can involve them. And I would like to encourage you with a couple of examples how you can do that and how we can prevent activist burnout as well. And we hope that this work can continue and does not have to stop because of a lack of funding. For example, we have the example of in the Bundestag. We have seen how willing the state is to finance revolutionary nation-building projects with billions and millions of euros, but they only focus on the perpetrator perspective. And I'd also like to mention the Culture Office of the BBK that has independent commissions that also counsel the municipalities, and they insist on the fairness of bids that are going out there and of tenders, that it cannot be possible that the politicians can pick the cherries out of the cake. And then another interesting example is the round table
der Initiative Stadt neu denken gegründet worden ist, also eine Gruppe von UrbanistInnen, ArchitektInnen, aber auch Leute, die im sozialen Bereich arbeiten, und die haben
and they work also in social areas, and they went to the parliament in Berlin and said, we're the roundtable for real estate and we need a room on a regular basis for our meetings, and that actually worked. That's why it's great that we can hold the symposium here in this very traditional laden, power-laden room here and location, the historic halls of the municipality. What also occurs to me when you talked about burnout is the fact that activists and artists and theoreticists in these contexts, they just feel their limits and when it comes to their health and their own well-being. And that's why Oliver Hart had also mentioned perseverance, and perseverance is only possible if you have holding structures, if you have some structures that can support you for a long time as well. And a very classic example for that are parties. Parties are structured in such a way, for example, the Social Democrats, the oldest party in Germany, without romanticizing it, they were structured in such a way that they can prevail even across crises, across the National Socialist time, even though if they were persecuted, for example. And they continue existing. And we have NGOs who have that same question. Greenpeace, for example, how can they keep their work up? How can they work over decades? And even for these topics, it's very important to think about the holding structure, the supporting structure. And many people, they have been thinking about that for a long time already, of course. And the second thing that occurs to me is what Noah had mentioned, the point that she made about this Remembrance Commission. Commemoration Commission. Sometimes you just need the initiative to institutionalize yourself. So it's okay, now we need a commission and we are the members. Or these people should also be members of this commission. And all of these are thoughts that have been passing my mind. We are always outside, we're always against structure, we're against institutionalization. And then you also have the risk that you are undermining yourself, right? But maybe we can have a look at the rest of your notes later on, but let's see what the others have to say. Hi, my name is Gürsay Dotash.
I co-curated the Saturday with Jörg, and it's the preparations and the implementation was quite, I learned a lot. The Commemoration Commission is something that I picked up as a term, as a concept. You also emphasized this, and Maria nodding tells me that this has actually, found open ears there. The way it was described and the way it could be the moment where Ibrahim Aslan, who wanted to be listened to, Talia, who wanted to be listened to, and found that it didn't work properly. Maybe we were in the symposium not the best listeners for these situations. We opened spaces where we could listen. The Commemoration Commission could be a place where this discourse happens first, where this listening happens, where you can make plans and where moments could be developed which could be organized along the needs of these affected people. Talia and Ibrahim, from my point of view, talked about the right concepts. It can't be that objects are finished and put in front of the people who were affected by what's commemorated, who wanted to be they have to be taken in when this thing is designed. And you have to talk to a large group of affected people. Ulf worded this really well, how many people were affected. It's the families, it's activists, it's an entire circle of people who claim a right to be heard. You have to listen, but only you have to work out how you could get this to work. But maybe in this kind of talk in the Commemoration Commission, it might not be necessary to have an object in the public sphere. Maybe they want a different type of stabilizing for this memory, or no, that doesn't follow along the mechanisms of nation building, where public space and is used. And I would like to pick up on what Monique said. There's a particular aesthetic tradition that comes from these public spaces. It's not the same in each country, of course. Something, a second part, and also the end of my remark, it's what Aisha said about empathy and what Maria said about empathy. I think empathy, I'm really happy because that she found open ears with her. We looked at different aspects, but they are interlocked in so many ways, we're not talking about a deliberate space that says that people in the public space, people are in an exceptional situation, that you should look to them as peers, you know. Nancy Fraser could show this with Habermas, and it's maybe important to have an empathetic open space and leave open space as a place where conflicts are acted out. This is something that is what I'm going to take home with me, and I'll continue thinking about it. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much to both of you for your very significant and contribution to Saturday and Friday, and also today. What I would like to say before we open the discussion to the audience, what I would like to mention is a question we talked about very briefly yesterday. I think it's a completely important aspect, which is undisputed. A real discussion at eye level, from not only with those who are affected by it, but by those who have to have the right to talk and to be listened to and be represented suitably. And so you then have a different level that could come into play here, and which, sorry, with Ulu or with Ulf and other artistic ideas for art in the public sphere, also in a narrower sense, things that are erected somewhere in an urban space. But at the same time, we need to create space for artistic idiosyncrasy, so that we can open a playing field for something that's not entirely there to fulfill legitimate needs. And also, and this is a question for me, is still a point where there is a lot of friction. What do you think? The first thing that comes to my mind is how can these talks be updated? How can these repetitive questions that keep coming back? This question is not a new question. It keeps coming back. It's been accompanying us for years. It has accompanied others in this room. Maybe it's important to see there are permanent processes that won't stop. The question is, which role does art play in the public sphere? What is the common ground? What can you achieve? At the same time, there are very brief moments that are supposed to be brief and could be ended and could be final and complete. For example, whose history are we telling? Whose story are we telling? The next question would be to understand there's plurality, and how do we tell these stories, and about whom, and who do we tell them to? Each other? And who do we invite to this storytelling?
But maybe we do have some questions from the audience. There we go, the first hand is up. Okay, so I don't have a question really, but more I'm trying to summarize the summary for myself. First of all, thank you very much for making the symposium public so that everyone could participate. And as Zoe, you had already said, I think it's very important that this happened. That was done in Nuremberg. We have many, many places here and many happenings here that we have to think about. What I did miss, without having known the others, I do miss seeing more representatives from the city. I'm very happy to see that Mr. Ulrich is here again to hear at the final discussion. But I think it is very unfortunate that Ms. Lena did not stay. She is the representative for culture here in Nuremberg, and I think it's sad that she didn't stay here because we talked about so many things that are very specific to Nuremberg that need to be discussed in this framework. We talked about the Humboldt Forum. We talked about the Pella House, the Black Pella House that is to be rebuilt. These are dimensions that are quite similar and that you need to discuss and talk about. And I would have liked to have seen more representatives of the city of Nuremberg to be here to participate in these discussions. And not only that strangers or people from outside are the ones who have to address the issue of the Rainbow Preludium. But thank you nevertheless for this event. I'm gonna see it as a statement, and we're gonna put it to the minutes as a statement. Any other statements or questions? My name is Ellen Seiferman, and as we are part from the Kunsthalle, the art hall, and I'm the director of it, of course, we are very much part of the area of competence of the mayor for culture, and she did explain yesterday why she could not stay here. And there are many different possibilities to continue the discussion that we've had in these 3 days and to see and participate from afar, from home or from your phone. So I don't know, we do not know who listened in and who did not. So I do not think that the city of Nuremberg is not interested. And of course, there are many things that I have written down here and much of the information that I'm going to carry forward to the Kunsthalle. So thank you very much for all of your presentations and lectures and contributions. Thank you to Andreas Wissen, Christel Passmann, and your team, especially Mr. Ulrich as well, who made it possible that we have this event, this Congress. And with our budget at the Kunsthalle, we would not have been able to make it. So thank you very much for taking it over. I would like to add to that. Thank you as well. Now, before we start thanking people, I would like to thank the people that you mentioned, and I will do so again later on. But first, we need to see if we have more questions. Okay, no one's making you. Is there anything we want to say? Well, there's a lot, but I think we're just going to save it for our next meeting. All right, then let's just finish it up. Let's wrap this up. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. And I hope you have a very nice Sunday and have a safe return home. Bye. Okay, yes, then now we are saying our thank yous. Thank you very much for everyone who took your time to come here, came for 3 days and have think and a discussion about what we understand as art and public art. And I think the online format worked quite well. Does that mean that we were able to understand everything into the very last detail? I listened to your presentation, which I thought was quite interesting. I listened to Ms. Rüllisch, but then I must admit I'm only an architect, so it just went over my head. I did not understand very much of that. But thank you for Mr. Heiser. I think you have put together a wonderful panel, a round of very important statements that we were able to gain from these events. Thank you, Ms. Plaza Lasso. I hope it's 4 names. You could get in trouble with that. Thank you very much for participating as well. Also, sorry, Claire Miller, you have contributed a lot. And I also thought that your critical statement was very important. And Monika, to leave, Doctor, I already said thank you to you. Thank you to the Kosbacher Stiftung and Rudolf von Eberhard Bauer Stiftung, which is the reason why we can be here. Many people are giving foundation money to this municipality, to the city. That's why we can make these kind of events. And that's why we can be in this room here that is not authentic because it was destroyed in the World War, but rebuilt. But that's why we still have a certain virtuality, but it's a fitting virtuality. We would have liked to be closer together, but now we can keep to the rules of social distancing. So thank you very much, and I think it was awesome. It was great that you were able to give us also a critical view of the event. Was the approach correct? Was the room where we are sitting in a good choice? And also the topic that we made it for free. For me, I'm a father, I have small children. It was a huge advantage to be able to just listen in over YouTube and to just see the recordings, listen to the recordings afterwards. I think this format was very successful. What I take home is that we are talking about how art is political, but we have a different approach on how art has an effectiveness, how it affects the public space. And you said it has to be on the space, it is specific to the spaces, and you need to reinterpret what the spaces are. And I think these are things that we always are going to think of an object. Maybe at the end we don't have an object. So I think that's something very interesting we were able to see in these past days. That we can see it and that we can hear it. It's thanks to our interpreters. We cannot see them, but we were able to listen into them. So that's why thank you very much to the interpreters. You have done a wonderful job. And it was very valuable, your work. Thank you very much to Andreas Wissen, Ms. Seifermann, Christel Passmann, Susanne Scholl, and of course our audio team, our audiovisual team. They made it possible that we could do this event as we did it, and we'll continue with this format. This is not the last time. We're going to try to rediscover the public space in this city and other cities using art and using all the different aspects of art, of perception. The first panel we were able to see here, and it's going to be documented. We're going to have information, and it's not going to be forgotten. It's going to have repercussions on the reality of Nuremberg. We have a number of exhibitions in situ, for example, in the Kunsthalle, or in situ. That's the correct pronunciation of that. That's an exhibition that will be available until January. It was organized by Ms. Seifermann, and it is in direct relationship with the topics that we have discussed today and yesterday. So thank you again very much for coming. Thank you for taking your time, for giving us all these new and interesting insights here that will enrich Nuremberg and will keep enriching Nuremberg. Please do come back soon again, and I hope that you can come back soon as well. Work together with your city, on your city, and with your city. And we can see that we do have a couple of people from the municipality. Not everyone has to show their political face. Sometimes the ones who do the actual work are the ones who are important. So get back home safely. Thank you for coming, and thank you for coming to Nuremberg. Stay healthy. Bye.